Luther Series 3 is a very dramatic, confrontational, perhaps conclusive season of TV that aired in mid-2013, 2 years after Luther Series 2. We're going to talk in depth about the 4 episodes of this series and also dig deeper into its creator, showrunner, sole writer Neil Cross than we did in our discussions of the first 2 series. Let's just dive right in. All Series 3 spoilers fair game, but nothing from beyond. That means nothing from Series 4, 5, the 2023 film The Fallen Sun, anything too specific from the prequel novel. So diving in now will be myself, Neo from Australia, as well as long-time Luther fan Tyler, and I think maybe in a sense long-time viewer Ingiga. Gig, did you see these early series as they came out in the early 2010s?
Yeah, I saw series 1, 2 and 3 as they came out. I was eagerly on the live watching train for the finale of series 1, and since then I was sort of on the ride, and it wasn't until after sometime like sort of between series 3 and 5 that I kind of lapsed and became a sort of lapsed Luther viewer.
Tyler, when did you watch the show?
Yeah, I was kind of the same. I watched it live, but I wasn't. I was quite young, so I wasn't really super into the show or anything. I enjoyed it when it was on, and then it was a few years later that I discovered it again. So I have 2 or 3 phases of my Luther enjoyment.
I want to start, as we did with discussing Series 2, and ask both of you, how is this series different from the last one, and from Series 1 for that matter? And how do you think Series 3 flows from the ending of Series 2? Remember Series 2's ending, Luther's big climactic confrontation with the RPG gamer Chaos Magic twins, well, one of them anyway, culminating in a big epic suicidal fuel dowsing sequence in a truck where the whole city saw Luther save London from a sort of suicide bombing homegrown terrorism type deal. What's different with Series 3 and how did it flow on from Series 2's ending?
I think the better question really is what's not different. What's not different? It's quite pat. It's Luther that needs shaking up, I think, which is not necessarily bad because the Luther that has come before season 3 is good, often great, and there's some good, sometimes great stuff in season 3. But there's nothing particularly engaging in a way that seasons 1 and 2 were for me, and then seasons 4 and 5 were. In other ways.
Gig, what about you?
I think in a lot of ways it's sort of a conscious return to status quo Luther almost, which it rings a bit strangely because the end of series 2 had Luther seemingly in this happier place with a sort of not quite surrogate daughter figure, but someone who was looking after. Things seemed to be on the up and up. Series 2 ended quite happily, I thought. So series 3 starts and Jenny, she's just disappeared into the ether, and Luther's now living in this gothic ruin with a photo of his dead wife next to a pic of David Bowie, and it's sort of like it's another kind of Big Finish box set of Luther type thing.
Same old.
But I would say the way in which overall it differs from series 2 is that by the end of series 3 it's trying to be a bit more I guess final. It tries to be a bit more of a big statement, so to speak. I think it tries to almost mimic the ending of series 1 in some ways again, and I think it tries to draw itself together at the end into more of a big conclusive climax, which I wouldn't say series 2 did quite as much. I'd say it starts off a lot like series 2, then in the second half it changes a bit to try and mimic series 1 again. The
2 stories in series 3 are quite different, aren't they? The first story is, so the first 2 episodes of series 3 is one thing, and then the episodes 3 and 4, that story felt to me like I know Idris Elba forever has been talking up the Luther movie. I was watching an interview today where in a 2013 interview about on the Pacific Rim press junket for that film he was in, he was talking about, we're getting the movie going and Alice is going to be back. This was 2013. And so he's all hyping up, the series can move into movie form now.
It's come back with a real ratings and critical bang. I was wondering if it has helped the ball to start rolling on the movie front or series 4 at all?
It's definitely solidified our intentions for sure, because it's good that we have been off the air for so long, and there was a sort of worry that maybe the audience didn't want to see it again, and it came back with such open welcome. So now it's made us a little bit more focused in on trying to bring in the script for the movie
and bring back Alice Morgan, I hope, as well.
Alice Morgan, she'll be back.
That took 10 years to do. But I think the second two-parter in Series 3 feels kind of cinematic to me in it's not just the large stakes, because I think Series 2's finale also had large stakes with the city and everything, but also, like Gig said, it kind of circles back around to Series 1 in some ways, and that circularity always makes things feel a bit bigger, and it's just a kind of huge story, and I think it kind of confronts the nature of the show. The kind of Batman-ish vigilante Tom Marwood figure, I feel like he and George Stark, who's like the cop trying to get Luther across this series, they both feel like mirrors of different aspects of Luther to me. So it just felt like a very kind of self-interrogating kind of finale. I was really wrapped through the second story in Series 3. But the first one, what do we think of the first story in Series 3, the first 2 episodes?
I think some elements of it almost feel like Luther verging into a comic self-parody, I think, in some points. Like sometimes it's just like deliberately very funny. Like I love Luther comparing himself to Jamie Oliver. And then, you know, when it comes to the big confrontation with the killer in the second episode, you know, Luther says to him, "Say something," and the guy's just like, "Ah!" and charges at him. I mean, it gets very ludicrous at points. It's this kind of almost send up of Luther as a show. I mean, it's sort of mildly entertaining, but it's another kind of rubbish serial killer who's deeply just very pathetic and and then also a bit two-dimensional in some ways too.
Yeah, I feel quite the same. I think it's kind of a standard day's work for Luther, which is obviously not something particularly interesting, is it? I don't find that Cross is doing anything really engaging with the character or any kind of new take on a serial killer or a kind of crime. It's just Luther as is. It's the Lutherist episode of Luther.
So something I found funny during those first 2 episodes, particularly there's a point in the first episode where Luther's trying to investigate the case, and then he gets something else dumped on him, and he's like, "Okay, let's do both." And it reminded me of how Chris Chibnall writes his Doctor Who at times, just having lots of separate subplots for the Doctor to work on. But you know, on that note, like the subplot running through the first 2 episodes is also Luther interfering with the case of that guy who killed the online cyberbully kind of tormentor. Kind of guy, with Luther kind of sticking his neck in and sort of possibly making things worse there, out of some possible desire to maybe protect the guy who took the law into his own hands. I think that sort of subplot seems to be like the more interesting aspect of those first 2 episodes compared to the sort of serial killer fan who is also the son of the victim of the serial killer. Yeah.
I think for me, the relative flatness of a lot of the first two-parter here, it's compounded by, like, I know not everyone likes this, but something I like about Luther is that nearly every form of it is pretty different. Like Series 1 is 5 or 6 individualish cases, and then Series 2 is 2 two-parters, and then there was the prequel novel, so that's a whole different format. Then Series 3 is 2 two-parters, Series 4 is 1 two-parter, and Series 5 is like 1 four-parter, and then there's a film in 2023. Series 2 and 3 are the only times we get the same thing twice, pretty much, which is 2 two-parters. And I don't know, just structurally, it misses that Luthery thing to me, which is, what have we got this time? And it's a totally different thing, which is maybe the feeling of, you know, same old, just the Luther and the Ripley and the Force kind of thing that we get with some of it.
Yeah, there's a conscious sense, I think, this time that Luther, the show, is starting to maybe run out of juice or run out of ideas, which I think informs where it ends up going in the second half of this series.
I do think with the start of episode 1 in Series 3, it's interesting to me. Like, Series 2's ending, I know, Tyler, you and I especially, maybe ranked's the wrong word, but we noticed it's a really big deal. Like, you'd think Luther would be a bit famous after that. Like, he'd receive some sort of accolade from London or something. Like, he saved a lot of the city in this super public way. And then Series 3 starts, and I guess not.
Yeah.
And also, Series 2 started weirdly disconnected from Series 1 to me. Like, Series 1 ends in such a climactic way. And then Paul McGann's mark is in Series 2 and everything, but it didn't feel that linked with how Series 1 ended to me. Whereas Series 3, it opens up and he's looking at a photo of Zoe from Series 1 and he's looking at postcards from Alice. It feels a little more linked in that way.
I think the show kind of has a perpetual problem with following up its own cliffhangers at the start of the next series. Like, it'll end a series at one point, and then it'll start the next series and be like, okay, we need to return to status quo somehow. And there might be some lip service to how the previous series ended, but not a great deal. It won't feel hugely borne out of where they left off.
And this is a result of the comic book nature of the show. I think it's the result of Luther as Batman, and everything sort of resets at the beginning of each season. And yeah, you're right. That has happened in every season. It happens again in this season. In the previous season, it was Alice in the psych ward, wasn't it? And
Yeah.
Luther breaking her out within sort of 10 minutes of that first episode, and that's the end of it. It's not something I personally am against. I quite enjoy that mode of storytelling, but there does often come a point, and I think for me the hard reset of this season of Luther walking back into his standard day's work. He removes that guy from that garage, and Justin's got a bit of bone in his skull, and all in a day's work. And he goes home and he looks at the photo of Zoe, and he looks at the card of Alice, and it feels sluggish. It feels you go into it with a sense of, oh right, so we're just back, are we? Luther's back. Great, okay.
I think it doesn't help that the side thing Luther is dealing with during those first two episodes and sort of throughout, with the whole the special unit with George and Erin trying to investigate Luther, they're not very convincing as a threat to Luther, I think is the problem. They George gets a lot of dialogue about how, oh, they unretired me, I'm really badass, oh, I'm gonna get you, Luther. But at no point does he actually become a convincing threat to Luther. Nothing suggests, I mean, it's impossible to take him seriously. There's nothing that suggests he'll be better at catching John out than anyone else to date. So and then they pretty much give up on it because they show him being a useless alcoholic later on. I mean, it's just like why is this guy here? It's just kind of an annoyance, like a little gnat flying around Luther's head. One
of the biggest fist pump the air moments of the whole show for me is Marwood just shotgun blasting George Stark out of the story.
Yes, although that in itself is almost like we're giving up on this character. Like we don't have anything to do with him. Bye,
Stark is the Henry Madsen of season 3, isn't he? Where you get 3 or 4 episodes in season 1 of Henry Madsen, and you think that maybe I think you suspect that this is an arc that is slowly building into the finale, and it's just kind of dropped. That's kind of what Stark is. In the promo for series 3, Idris was talking up George Stark is like, oh, he uses some of Luther's techniques against him.
We introduce a new character, Stark, who's basically, sort of set up as Luther's arch nemesis, and he is a formidable character, and he's very, gun-ho on getting Luther, and almost using his own techniques. I think that's what's going on here with David. He's so in Luther's face.
And, it's like a whole big cracked mirror type of thing, and yeah... I feel like Tom Marwood is that quite successfully, like a cracked mirror of Luther and a reflection and an amplification of different bits of him. But George Stark is just useless. And it's like Gig said, he's this pathetic alcoholic. And even Erin's like, why am I, working with this guy? He's just such a failure. And Luther catches them out. He gets to their hideout and goes, wow, where's my code name?
Yeah.
And he just humiliates them and walks away. It's a really pathetic kind of attack on Luther.
Yeah, literally the end of episode 2, they're running the shittest undercover operation in human history. Luther just goes in there like, hey, I win, bye-bye. You lose, you suck. It's just, wow, okay. What was the point of that?
But what do we think of Erin? She's the other half of this operation. What do we think of her this series?
Erin is the more interesting half of the Stark-Erin dynamic because we already know her.
Yeah.
Because she's already an established character from season 2, and we already understand her relationship with Luther. What Cross, I think, fails to do with Stark is give him any sense of threat or any sense of a relationship with Luther. It's so unclear why he hates Luther so much as he does. It's nonsensical that he has such a he's so hell bent on taking John Luther down when he's never met the guy before, and we've never met this guy before. We don't have any idea where he was working in the Met and what he was like. It doesn't make any sense. But Erin does have a personal vendetta, and she does have that need that she doesn't want to admit for validation from John that she's never received. And so there is an interesting vendetta that gives her justification for her actions.
Yeah, and also Erin wants to do good on some level. Like in the last episode, we see her trying unsuccessfully, like cover for Mary and getting shot as a result. I was very relieved that Erin survived at the end.
Yeah.
I was wondering, like, surely they wouldn't kill her off like that, would they? No, she lives. But you know, throughout the show, she's much more interesting than Stark, purely because she has some sort of inner conflict. You know, she's kind of wavering back and forth on whether this whole stupid plan is worth doing.
Do you agree with me that she enjoyed kissing Ripley in the car?
I think they both enjoyed it. I think the way that the two of those actors play that dynamic from that moment on is subtle glances at each other and looking at each other in a particular way. And that all happens after the kiss.
And yet, in the last episode, Alice just casually drops that she thinks Erin is a lesbian. That was such a what of a moment. I was like, hey, excuse me? What? Come again?
Yeah, I read that. I was going to ask you guys about that, actually. I read that as just a homophobic joke line. I don't read that as a character trait of Erin's.
I mean, I don't know. I feel like Alice is supposed to be, the super smart, clever one, almost like the Doctor Who figure, the Sherlock analog who can, point out things about people. So when she says that, it almost like, it's like, in series 1 of Doctor Who, when Doctor's like, he's gay and she's an alien. It reminded me of that. Sort of like this thing of Alice being more perceptive. So almost and yeah, it's sort of a gag, but at the same time, I wonder, are we meant to take it somewhat seriously, as a reveal about Erin? So it was very puzzling, because earlier on they seemed to be setting up that whole romance with Erin and Ripley, and so it just felt a bit directionless overall. What do you really know what you're doing with this character?
There's that exchange in the police HQ Erin and Ripley have, where Ripley's like, "Do you want to talk about this properly, as human beings, like a drink or something?" And Erin's all kind of awkward because she's a very by the book, bookish, not social, charismatic actor, actor in the story. I'm not talking about the actor, character in the story, than some of the others around. And that felt like a little flirtation being played up to me. Maybe even one of those humanizing moments you give a character you're about to kill soon. I'm meaning Ripley there, not Erin.
Yes, a death flag for Ripley, very much.
Yeah. And that they have I like the little exchange where Erin pulls Ripley into a room and doesn't say anything. And so he says, "Is this like a Darren Brown thing?" She says, "Who? Mind reader, mentalist, reads minds." And she's a bit flustered, and you don't want to read my mind. It's full of scorpions right now.
Scorpions.
Ian quoted Macbeth in series 1 as well, didn't he?
Yeah, very, very successfully. I really liked that line. He says something along the lines of, "It feels like my brain's full of spiders," or something like that. So it's not quite the same line, but it's hearkening to Shakespeare. Yeah.
What did you think? Speaking of tension like that, about Luther and Ripley's scrap in the first two-parter when they fight in the office and Schenk tries to stop it from happening. Also, that was a good hero moment for Ripley, getting the remains and not letting the remains be incinerated. It was nice for Ripley to have a win there.
But it's a win in a quite a sadistic way, isn't it? In the way that you as a viewer don't want it to happen, because your sense of justice, or certainly mine, and I think the intent is more aligned with John's, that Barnaby deserved the freedom to have killed that person and got away with it. So Justin succeeding in doing the by the book, morally right according to the British justice system thing is frustrating.
It's interesting how we see a bit more of Idris acting a bit of empathy or affection, at least this series. I think I'm thinking of with Barnaby, the dad who puts his hand in the blender that Luther calls, like we're talking about when he sits down with him in the kitchen after Barnaby had a breakdown. Luther looks really pained, and how he's touching his shoulder and reaching out to him. And later in series 3, when he hears the tape where Ripley really bigs him up, you can see Luther's eyes super touched and everything. So that's an interesting aspect of the acting Idris did in series 3.
Yeah, I think what another thing that undermines Ripley there is that when he comes to confront John and have a go at him, John was literally about to ring up the next victim of the current serial killer, and the fact that they have a scrap then instead of getting in touch with her means that she dies. So it's just events conspiring to kind of sort of undermine any sort of sense of heroism there. It's all very a bit of a mess. Although at the same time, the thing about Luther protecting his ghost, taking the law into his own hands, that does seem thematically related to the second two-parter, which is all about taking the law into our own hands and being cracked mirrors of Luther's morality and such.
Ripley, because this is his last go-around, he dies at the end. Ripley's actor Warren Brown says of his time over the show that, their first scene together where, I know Ripley's in the prequel novel, but his first scene in the show is, him looking all awed, meeting Luther, talking about, I've lobbied to, work with you. I'm your biggest fan, all that sort of thing. And he's just kind of glowing with, wow, I'm actually working with Luther. Warren Brown says he was like that with Idris. Like he didn't have to act much there. He was very kind of wowed by him at first. But over time, like the characters, they got chummy together and, equals and all that.
Ripley's relationship, it's built and built as he's worked with Luther, and they've worked together now for a while. His loyalties have been tested, and this series, I think that the relationship is put under the most strain that it has been throughout any of the series. Working with Idris has been fantastic. I kind of look back at the first series, and the meeting of Ripley and Luther, the first instance was of this character who really looked up to somebody who was senior to him, more experienced, and wanted to work with him. And it was fantastic for me because I was exactly in that same position myself, Warren, as an actor. I was a really big fan of Idris, really keen to work with him and respected him. So the first meeting that you saw in series 1 of those two meeting, I just kind of played how I felt when I first met him, as Ripley and Luther's kind of relationship, and as they've worked together, and that's got stronger, so as us as kind of actors and friends.
And so they had a very real life kind of progression with their characters. There's a lot of that with the show, hopefully not with Ruth Wilson, but Idris Elba also says that he finds it hard to separate Luther and himself, how knotted up he gets in the role as well.
I mean, I just love the depth of character, and it's one of those characters that, sort of like I know really well. I love playing him, but he's so absorbing that sometimes, it's hard to kind of like separate Idris from Luther when I'm playing him.
Because Warren Brown's gone now, since he dies here, what did you guys think overall of his performance in the show, but especially this series?
I think his performance is a pretty good manifestation of a character who's kind of I don't want to say the straight man, but just like the I guess the rock of sort of stability, or like almost like plainness, against which Luther is always contrasted. I think he does a very commendable job in terms of just being this sort of. They compare him to the puppy at one point in the series, don't they? I think he is always kind of the puppy, like simping for Luther, covering for Luther. It's like, wow. Yeah, I think he. I don't really have anything to criticize it when it comes to his performance. I think when it comes to the character, I think each series, like in series 2 a bit and series 3 a bit as well, I think they're always kind of grasping for what exactly to do with Ripley, and it culminates in them killing him off in, I think, ultimately quite a stupid way in this series, to be honest. I'm not hugely thematically satisfied with how he goes out. But in terms of the overall, it's just. Yeah, I mean, it's okay, basically. I'm just about sort of the whole thing.
Wait, I want to ask Tyler specifically what he thinks of Ripley's death in a second, since Gig just expressed distaste. But setting aside the story thing of Ripley dying, just in the structure of the show, I think it's really interesting because there are pillars of Luther, as a show. There's Luther himself and there's Alice, who are the two huge, biggest ones. But in series 1, we had Zoe and we had Ian. And we had Rose.
And Mark,
and I guess Schenk. And most of those got wiped out in series 1. And then coming through to series 3, we've lost Ripley. We have Luther, we have Alice, we have Schenk. But everything else kind of underpinning the show is the reoccurring big pillars is kind of gone. And I think that's interesting. I mean, we're not speaking about series 4 now, but it certainly puts the show in an interesting place to have to try and move on from next. I mean, I guess Erin is alive, but yeah. What do you think about the show just kind of shedded its skin very quickly in terms of main characters?
In series 3, something that it does to mitigate the effects of that is increase the Benny screen time and the Benny characterization, and then that gets further established over time.
I think there's almost a sense that the show having to. When the show kind of sheds its skin repeatedly like that, I think there is a sense that it's trying to keep itself rejuvenated or alive somehow. Okay, fuck, let's kill off, let's get rid of that character. let's do this. Almost in the sense that because they don't quite know how to keep the status quo going without having some huge shock like Ripley dying and Luther being bereaved again all over again.
Ripley's death itself Tyler, what do you think of the way he did? So he dies in that Marwood, our Batman figure, he's hanging the pedophile and the crowd's around. And so it's, a whole big thing. And then Luther tries to save the pedophile and the crowd gets angry at Luther. And then Ripley, who comes in to help. Chaos and pandemonium. Marwood takes advantage of the chaos, so he runs away. Ripley manages to find Marwood. Ripley hasn't got a gun drawn or anything. Marwood's got his iconic shotgun drawn on Ripley. And they have a conversation. It's interesting. So their exchange is like, Marwood compliments Ripley. I saw how you waded into that mob. That was brave. Nobody could ask any more of you, so just back off. Ripley's like, if you let me go, this is all going to carry on and someone innocent's going to get hurt and I can't live with that. And Marwood's like, don't worry, that's never going to happen. No one innocent's going to get hurt. Ripley's like, you've made your point, Marwood. You've done your thing. Everyone's talking about you and the issues you've raised. You've done what you needed to do. You can stop now. I'm a cop. We're on the same side. You're not going to shoot me, mate.
What are you going to do? Shoot me?
Famous last words.
Yeah, and he shoots him, and it's not a cathartic blast like George Stark got. It's a tragic blast, or is it a comic blast? Gig didn't seem that impressed with it. Tyler, what do you think?
It's I think that the way it's shot, no pun intended, is there's like a slow-mo of him being blasted back, which is completely different to the Stark death, which is really unceremonious and undignified. So it is intentionally played as tragic as it. I mean, it obviously would be. I do see it as that. I was and am pleased with it. I'm pleased that that the Ripley death came when it did. By this point in season 3, we've had about at the end of season 3, so we've had about 130 odd minutes of screen time, and nothing really has happened. There's not really been much drama for Luther. There's been serial killers and cases that he has to deal with, but it's just been so far a show about solving crimes. So it's taken this long.
It's like Sherlock.
It's taken us this long to get to a point where something has happened, and there's some kind of real conflict for John to deal with. And I think killing Ripley was something that had to happen. I have no strong feelings for or against the case in which it happened, or whether it should have been Marwood or whether it should have been via a shotgun, but I do think that it came at the right time, and it did good things for the season as a whole.
Yeah, I think I don't disagree with the placement of it or the decision to ultimately do it. I just think the way it plays out is a bit strange. I think the bigger problem, is my issue with Marwood's motivations for some of his actions. Like his decision to actually just straight up point blank just load the entire barrel into Ripley's chest right there. It just seems to be a bit like, what? Why did he do that? Like, why didn't he just do one of the countless alternatives available to him?
That's really interesting, because I actually think I completely see how this can happen. I can completely track how a man like Marwood can be motivated on nuanced levels, obviously, on the surface level, that being the need to avenge his wife, which is understandable, and then on the inner level, as Alice says in episode 4, that he has a need to be loved and respected. So I can understand him on that level, but I also can completely see the way in which one in that sort of situation can find themselves in the same way that Ian was in season 1, backed into a corner again and again and again by their own actions and making things worse in trying to save themselves.
Just the actual mechanics of the scene confuse me. Maybe I'm media illiterate here, but Marwood's got the shotgun, and does Ripley have a gun on him at this stage and he's just not got it out? What's going on with Ripley?
I think he's just refusing to go away and leave Marwood alone.
So, if Marwood had jumped the fence and ran away, is the fear just that Ripley's going to keep chasing him, and then Ripley's going to... So is Marwood just trying to say, to stop a meep 10-minute chase happening, I'll kill you unless you don't stop? Why didn't Marwood just shoot out his kneecap or something? Or what was actually the fear of what was going to happen? This might be my fault here, but I've always been a little confused just what was going on there.
Worth remembering, he does take out Luther's knee later on. He shoots Luther in the leg later on, so he's not against the leg thing.
Yeah.
I view it as a matter of principle. And I think the difference in shooting Luther's leg, obviously, other than the fact that Luther's the protagonist and it's not possible to kill him, I think it's worth noting that Alice says to him, "Everybody hates a cop killer," and that's something that is immediately in his mind, that he doesn't want to be known as the guy that's killed 2 cops in the process of doing his show trials thing.
Why kill him at all? Why not just shoot his leg?
My point was that I see it as a moment of failure and shock for Marwood, and him acting on his principles. He feels entitled to do what he's doing, and he feels that on a matter of principle, either back off or you will die, and he follows through with it. And he has that moment of fear and concern before he does it, and then he does it, and then he cries a bit, and then he runs off.
I can buy it psychologically, but more from like Neil Cross's perspective, I feel like if Ripley had a gun drawn on or something and was like, with better dialogue, but was like, Marwood, if you, Marwood, I'm going to shoot you in the leg, and then you won't be able to carry out your vigilante Batman plans. So, what's it going to be? Like a standoff? Maybe this is a terrible idea, and it's better that Neil Cross...
Was Ripley carrying a gun, or were you just hypothesizing?
No, he wasn't. Well, he didn't have one in his hand in that scene. Ripley's arms aren't even in his jacket pockets. They're by his side in the scene. So he's pretty defenseless, and they're just having kind of like a moral debate there. I don't know. It's like, I don't not buy what Marwood does psychologically. It just feels like the scene could have been tightened a little bit.
I can buy it as him like panicking and just doing something very like, he's just like... So in a moment of sort of weakness and panicking, freaking out, like, oh fuck, I just killed this guy. But I think they play up so much how invested Marwood is in his own sense of moral goodness, that what he's doing is good, that he won't harm the innocent. No one innocent will be hurt. I'm doing the good thing. I'm just taking out the bad guy. So the fact that it's a huge thing for him to then just up and kill and murder this guy just for getting in his way,
I think Marwood's he's one of my favorite characters of the show. I think it's not just, it is kind of, he's created out of Luther. Like, he's such a reflection of Luther in so many ways. But I also think the actor inhabits him really well. The actor, I looked him up, he doesn't do that much work anymore. He was a lead in that Da Vinci's Demons show. He was a lead on that for years, but since he hasn't done that much work. And I'm confused because I thought he was quite good in this. Like, he stands out to me among all the villains of the show. Anyway, psychologically, I think he's got kind of an oppositional, entitled, narcissistic, as Tyler would say, thing. Like, Giggs talking about his obsession with this is all going to go to plan, it's not going to hurt any innocents. I think he's got, you see it more in the very last episode, this very oppositional, like, if it's not my way, then, well, I'm going to break down, and this can't be happening, I'm in charge here kind of thing, which is interesting. But I think another big facet of his personality is the media, public relations type of stuff. Like, he's got the Save-Caitlin website. He's using an early version of Twitter. It was contemporary at the time. He's using Twitter to hashtag, do we hang the pedophile or do we save the pedophile? Like, he seems media savvy, or at least very media active in all those ways, which is, why it confuses me he kills a cop, because surely Alice isn't the one who clues him into, that's really bad for your optics there, is to kill a cop. I'm sure he realized that on some level earlier. So it's just like he's overwhelmed. It's such a bad choice to kill Ripley. I think if he hadn't killed Ripley, his plans might have worked out quite a lot better. I
think the show had a sort of structural need to have Marwood and Luther in more big opposition. Yeah. So from that point onwards, we have Marwood stalking Mary at Luther's house and just shooting up Luther's house. I love the shot of him pointing the gun at the mirror and sort of cringing and wincing and just pulling the trigger. It's kind of one of those moments where the show kind of lapses or almost tips into comedy again. But they have this whole thing where he sort of starts being really bound up with Luther in particular. I think that's important for the whole thematic mirroring of the two of them. But at the same time, it's we're getting further away from the idea of Marwood as this, whatever the concept of him wants to be, as this public avenger or whatever, and more as a sort of rival antagonist to Luther specifically.
This is with Marwood again. We're swirling around it. There's that exchange. It's even there's a river or water, whatever, separating them. It's I like this exchange a lot, where they're having the kind of moral debate on vigilantism and policing and everything, and we're not so different, you and I type of thing, which is why Giggs says, structurally he needed to do something so bad they actually would get drawn into opposition. But It's Marwood saying 1 out of 5 murders are committed by men on bail. Luther's saying, of course, I know that. We all know that in the Force. Marwood's questioning, why does nobody do anything about it? Luther says, because it's complicated. Then they both agree, no, it's not complicated. And so they're kind of getting this understanding. And more than that, they're getting agreement. Luther has to toss him his phone. You know, that drives a lot of the plot to come, in his wallet. Marwood's talking about, they want all these bad guys locked up so they can't harm anyone else. Luther, surely you can't disagree with that. Luther says, not the motive, but yes, the means. Marwood says, you've never been tempted to administer a bit of personal justice. And Luther, what adjective can I use for his response? It's ironic, perhaps, that he says, I don't have the right to do that. And as viewers, we know, well, all through the episodes we've seen before, he takes things into his own hands constantly.
Yeah, every day. That's how he approaches the job.
Yeah. And so then Marwood's, kind of appealing, give me 2 days. That's all I need to make things better. And Luther's saying, I can't do that. But there's definitely a wavering there, isn't it? He's not like just flatly, no way, man, you're the bad guy and I'm opposing you. I think there's definitely there's something being shared there. Tom, they're going to kill you. That's how these things end. Marwood has the very Batmanish line, like, I died the day I came home and found my wife's corpse. That sort of thing. Don't make me your enemy, John. We're on the same side. Luther says, I'm sorry you think that. It's a big, important exchange. I think there's lots going on there. What do we think of that exchange?
I like how it encapsulates the bind Luther is in the sense that ultimately, he is not one who actually respects law a great deal. He is constantly breaking the law. He's constantly taking the law into his own hands. He is constantly a hypocrite. But at the same time, he is so bound by the sense of, well, we have to maintain some kind of order or logic or hierarchy of who is allowed to, decide who lives and dies and stuff. We can't just let things lapse into chaos, but that of course is, it's hypocritical with his own actions. So, and that's how Luther gets into these situations where he's trying to save a paedophile and getting attacked by the angry mob, which I adore that sequence. It's so balmy and so bonkers. I love just the utter heightening of contradictions to almost farcical degree, stuff like that. I really love it. I think that sequence, I think on the whole, it just shows that Luther is this figure who is just at the intersection of numerous contradictions, and he's just stuck, really. He can't really do anything about it.
I feel like the fulfilled promise, I guess, given the ending of the series, of running away with Alice, it kind of hangs over this kind of exchange in an interesting way to me, because is the idea that if or when Luther and Alice run away together, that they're just going to go holiday and work through all the countries and that's going to be their days? Or is the idea that they're going, like, Luther can't keep away from solving things, but, to what extent is Alice going to work with that? Or what sort of trouble are they going to get into? What are they going to do? I think it's interesting to wonder, if he does leave the Force, what's he going to do?
In Series 2, they used to sort of talk about that. I think Alice sort of offers a proposition to what they might do if she ran away with Luther. And I think the implicit suggestion is there, maybe sort of hedonistic kind of a voyage, but also kind of an illicit one. I think the promise is almost that if Luther were to leave and be with Alice, he would be able to indulge the thing that he actually is, this beast of chaos, rather than a true creature of law that he is, LARPing as in the police force, if you see what I mean. So I think there'd be possibly some naughty crimes going on if he leaves with Alice.
Yeah, I agree that the implication is that they would be getting up to some kind of criminal hijinks in the same way that Alice. That's what Alice does. Alice is traveling. We hear some stories in episode 4 about things that she gets up to in Sao Paulo or wherever. And I think were John to go with her, that would be the plan, and that's part of the lure for him, isn't it? That's part of the thing that forms his desire to run away with her because he does he enjoys the chaos, and the two of them together have this really great dynamic where they in the same way that season 1 did a finale where the two of them plot to solve John's problem. We do the same thing in season 3, and the two of them love to work together and come up with schemes and plans to do some slightly illegal activities to get the outcome that they desire. So it's definitely, the implication is that they would be getting up to perhaps robberies and things, or maybe even murder. I do think that the end game for Luther, the character, is murder. So I think that's kind of what is always being teased. John as murderer.
Yeah, in a way, she makes him worse, and he maybe makes her better, but not much better in some ways. I think she definitely makes him worse. When they're together, they're like this sort of hybrid of sort of like chaos and sort of naughtiness. There's
two perspectives on this sort of what Luther would do outside of the Force thing I want to hear from. One is Idris Elba, like contemporary with Series 3, is asked about could Luther ever find peace? And he says no.
I think Luther definitely wants to fall in love and, sort of have some sort of happiness. His character's quite a dark and gloomy character, and, I think having a bit of love in his life helps recognise that, it's good to be in love, and it feels good for him. I think that, Alice has, been travelling around the world and they've kept in touch. He's still close to her, very much where he left off, I guess she's the one sort of antagonist that kind of like he cannot get rid of, so to speak. No, I don't think he'll find peace. No, I think he'll always seek people that do wrong. He'll seek it out, and they'll seek him out. He's just kind of got that energy. You know what I mean? People will come to him if something has gone wrong. So even if he leaves the Force, I suspect that Luther will always be John Luther, whether he's a policeman or not. I think he'll always just be that guy that sort of can't help himself, but seek those that feel they can just get away with being bad to other people. I think John will always do that, and if he does that for the rest of his life, he'll never get peace.
And so I think Idris's 2013 suggestion there could spell trouble in paradise for Alice and Luther running away. What do you guys think of Idris's pretty blunt "no, he can't find peace" answer?
I respect that. In the same way, I've said this many times before. I really respect Idris's connection with this character, and he clearly understands him very, very well and spends a lot of time thinking about how he operates. And I agree that with what I think is his sentiment there, that John is like two sides of a coin, in the way that I don't know if you've ever met a police officer or a criminal who would say something like, in another life, or had things done differently for me, I would have been a copper, or vice versa. And that's kind of what John is. He's just got the mind for criminality. And the John that we see currently, the John that we see in the series, is the crime-solving, moral justice John. But there is a version of that character that is begging to come out at some point while the show is on air. And like I said, I think that's what is always being alluded to.
Yeah, I think Elba is very on base when he says Luther can't really find peace, because he doesn't. Ultimately, I think part of the thesis of this series, in Series 3, is that Luther doesn't really want peace. He tries to set up this whole nice little life with this nice little normal girl Mary, but at the end of the day, what he chases after in the end is the madness, the thrill, the chaos. And I think the ending represents a final embrace of some kind of warped self-interest on Luther's part, finally, because he's been sacrificing so much of himself for this weird cause, this kind of saviour complex that he has. And at the end, he's finally saying, okay, I will throw off the coat, I will say, fuck it, I'm just going to do something for myself now, I will chase what I really want.
There's an interview with Neil Cross from 2011. It was actually about the prequel novel's release. But there's an answer in it he gives that touches on these kinds of ideas of Luther's characterization, and specifically what Luther could or couldn't do that wasn't the police force.
He's a man on a very short rope. I like the idea that the notion of the trouble detective is not unfamiliar from both literature and the screen. But I like the idea of somebody who's troubled not by the consequences of the job chafing against his personal life, but somebody who's involved in what he sees as kind of really moral process. That it's got less to do with law and order, where John Luther is concerned, than with pure notions of right and wrong.
He almost would have done well as a priest.
Absolutely. I think that's a very, very accurate summation of his essential character. And I think he would have been he would have been happier as a priest and more suited to that job.
Sort of a Savonarola.
Yes,
Yeah.
but he's disqualified, I think, by it. Although it's something we didn't explore very much in the show, it's something I wrote about a lot in the development of the show. In that he's a man who desperately wants there to be form in the universe, and desperately wishes there was some kind of moral order to the universe, but doesn't feel able to believe in God.
Who's this American voice?
It is Connie Martinson, an American writer and TV host who's hosted the syndicated television show Connie Martinson Talks Books on public TV for a very long time.
I love the way Cross specifies that something that was part of his formulation of the character was the idea of form and binary in the universe, and I think that's the dark matter thing, isn't it, in season 1?
Priest, moral order, God. That 2011 interview, Gig. What are your thoughts?
In some ways, it seems quite different from what we were talking about just now, about Luther being this kind of guy with criminality in him, in a way. But also, I think generally, the idea of wanting there to be form in the universe, a moral order, I think it is in some ways a desire for control. And I think that is related to the impulse towards all of these kind of law-breaking, sometimes quite cruel or controlling behaviours that Luther displays. I think, in a way, it is this need for things to just go his way, almost, for things to make sense and for things to come together in a way that he can understand. I think the things are related. I mean, I suppose in a sense, it's ironic. We were talking about him being kind of a criminal in another life, and Cross talks about him being a priest in another life. Well, we all know being a priest and being a criminal are not, mutually exclusive, as Stephen Moffat might agree. And I think so. While these two interpretations, they might seem sort of diametrically opposed, but I think they have more in common than they initially appear to.
I think Tyler was saying that the moral order stuff kind of connects in with very early in series 1, the talk about black holes and kind of cosmic nature of the universe and whatnot. That seems sort of linked, these big cosmic ideas of what runs the universe or doesn't run the universe. And I guess Luther yearns for something to run it, but there's nothing there. And then maybe that's the narcissistic drive that I can be it's like Doctor Who's Twice Upon a Time. Maybe there's just a bloke. Maybe there's just Luther. And that's the moral order of the universe.
Yeah. I think with detective shows where you have characters trying to deal with incredibly dark, grotesque murders, chaos, criminality, serial killers, all sorts of cruelty, and just general human evil, I think it's that those events and the things that they're dealing with kind of seem to reflect this uncontrolled, ungoverned universe, or existence. I think there is something existential about it that is always confronting, the detective figure in those scenarios, which is what puts them onto this whole existential mindset thing. Which is why in Luther we have this preoccupation with these incredibly dark serial killers, manifesting as sort of Luther's opposition to this chaotic universe that he just wishes would make some kind of sense. That's why the detective genre has so much of this kind of cosmic horror kind of thing to it, like True Detective.
I see in interviews a lot, Neil Cross, people will ask him, "What's your deal, man? Why are you so messed up?" And he has to kind of laugh it off and assure him, "I'm a normal person, trust me."
I get that sense with Cross. There are some most writers who you think you see people say, "Wow, that's so messed up. How did he come up with that?" And you think, "Well, it's his imagination. He's a writer." But there's something about Neil Cross. I don't know what it is. I don't know whether he's a very fearful, paranoid guy or he's got a dark streak to him. There's something about the things that he writes that I do think it's paranoia, based on the occultism stuff. I think that he's got some deep-seated anxieties about things. I think that's what it is. But he's a very specific type of horror writer.
He's a very scared man.
Yeah, scared of Idris.
I think the same way that someone like Moffat writes about sexual and masculine bravado so much of that is born out of, I don't mean to psychoanalyze, but he writes shows about himself. Look at Coupling. So much of that, his avatar character is focused on sexual insecurity. I think it's a common thing what a writer is insecure about. They amplify the opposite scenarios or the heightened or worst case scenarios into their dramas or their comedies.
Yeah, I joke about Cross being scared of being bullied by Idris, but I think that comes from the way that he writes. He does write from a fearful perspective It's Luther is kind of like Courage the Cowardly Dog, where anything and everything can be scary.
I think the teasing with Cross and Idris, I know Idris says he mixes himself and Luther up, but we shouldn't. The teasing between Cross and Idris, I think it's an endearing thing just because Idris has been talking about wanting to do a film forever, and it sounded like a pipe dream for so many of those years, and the fact it's actually happened is just, it's charming, it's funny. And I think it's because Idris so clearly likes Neil Cross. Like, he always is complimenting his writing. He's always talking up how dark and scary he can write, or how he was stunned by the scripts the first time he wrote them. Like, he clearly loves Neil Cross in his writing. So the idea of him like playfully bullying Neil Cross to get a movie going, it's not out of like disrespect for Cross, it's out of the opposite. It's that I really want to do more of this, get me more of this ASAP. The movie, it's hard because it's like a Netflix movie. I guess it's going to be hard to quantify, is it a hit or not, because it's such a different thing, those movies on streaming. But I hope it performs like they want it to perform. I hope it's a big deal.
I'd be surprised if it doesn't, to be honest. I'd be more surprised if it doesn't succeed. I think that even though Luther's been latent in the British consciousness for quite a few years now, I think that it's always in the back of people's heads. Everybody knows Luther. Yeah. Everybody knows Idris Elba. It's something that, as long as there's good enough marketing for it, as long as it's on the top banner of Netflix, as long as the BBC is always talking about it, people will talk about it.
It's the ratings are pretty interesting. Series 2 and 3 were very similar, and then Series 4 shot up quite a bit, and then Series 5 shot up quite a bit more again. And so that's increasingly long breaks between series, but the show is clearly, it's not getting less popular, it gets more popular over time.
Yeah, and it really is a cultural marvel in the sense that even people that haven't seen the show are aware of they have the image of what John Luther looks like in their heads, and the silly little car that he drives, and what the show's kind of about. I
guess it's just buoyed by the star power of Idris, which just continues on in the intervening years as well. It's kind of a symbiotic thing there.
Yeah, it's a huge part of it. Yeah. But I think the one of the things that Cross, I say Cross, I'm not sure whether this would have been so much Cross's domain, but one of the things that Luther really gets right, the production of Luther really gets right, is the aesthetic symbols. The car and the coat and the tie.
Yeah.
And I mean, Idris Elba has a very distinctive look anyway. He's a really tall, very handsome guy anyway.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of symbols that I associate with Luther. The Alice's red hair, the colour red in general. There are many things that I associate with the show.
I think London is the show is London as much as it is Luther. And that's,
yeah.
I don't know how clear it is to Brits, but to non-Brits, that's very loved. Like, Americans love that. I know Commonwealth people love that. Seeing London is cool. People like that.
Yeah, I think the reason that the British people, myself for sure, and the British people that I know that have seen Luther like the way that London is in Luther is because it is the murky East London, South East London. There's not central London. The kind of the grimy, dirty, deindustrialized, post-Thatcher London that everybody really knows. Everybody really knows that's what London's like. And as a tourist, that's not the place that you go. And as somebody that doesn't live in London, you don't go to. You go to central London, you do the nice bits, and that's it. Because why would you want to go to the nasty bits? But everybody that lives in the area or around the area is aware that the murderers don't exist, and the comic book nature of the show doesn't exist. But that image of London is real. That's not something that they've hammed up for the screen. That is how London proper is.
It's like there's a verisimilitude to it. People might not know they're missing from other London shows, but when they get it in Luther, it feels scandalous or like intoxicating or just novel, I guess. Yeah. I think also with the promotion of the Fallen Sun movie, I've had people have like said that to me, like, oh, isn't that interesting? That big photo of Idris trekking through the snow in his Luther costume, and it's like, oh, it's not London. And for people to be wowed at a show not being somewhere, it has to have been really successfully tied with somewhere in the first place for its absence to be a big deal. So I think that's interesting with the film, the fact it's not in London. It just kind of emphasizes how much London is part of the show.
Yeah, yeah.
This series 3, it's quite scary, I thought, a lot of it. There's the episode 1 of series 3 opens with the guy under the bed. Very Listen, isn't it? A guy like grabbing from underneath the bed. Like that's a very kind of primal childhood horror. And then episode 1's ending, well, nearly the ending, the action kind of ending, is this pretty terrifying closing sequence with the cat in the ceiling, and the husband goes up to investigate, and the killer's like shrouded behind, and then he attacks him, and then the husband bloodied, like falling through the roof, and the wife seeing it. It's pretty terrifying because it's so tied to what I know Neil Cross talks about a lot, the fears of the home being invaded or you not being safe at home. I thought those were all pretty scary. What did you guys think of those sequences? Also, the house, it's one of those houses that's like, we had that big wide shot and you can see entirely into the house, like from outside, which that alone scares me.
Yeah, it's not a very private home anyway, is it? This is the scariest that Luther has been so far, and perhaps has been so far up to the upcoming film. There's a real sense of body horror to the head coming out of the ceiling, and the fact that he's knocked out for a second, and his wife screaming, staring into his eyes, and his eyes open. And it's really horrible.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the serial killer scenes, a lot of the time in Luther, I find them kind of, I can take or leave them. But I do think the element of them that I like is when they get weird. So like when the killer is behind the plastic and looks like a mannequin almost, or the shot of the guy kind of crashing through the ceiling covered in blood. I think when they really have some fun in terms of the imagery, I think that's when it gets quite delightful. That's sort of the comic book imagery and sort of almost surreal sort of horror kind of penetrating through. I think they have a lot of fun with that, and I think that is kind of a distinctive flair that Luther has.
There's an imagery thing I really loved. That's actually the actual very ending of episode 1 of series 3. So it comes after that sequence with the big, easily seeing in-house and the home invasion and everything. And after that, we go to these shots of London, and firstly we see, it's one of those shots where you can see in all the windows of like the tall building, and so you can see into everything there. And then we change perspective and we're looking on Luther, and he's looking out over the city. And there's a couple of things I want to talk about there. One is that it is so much like Blade Runner. We've got this piano kind of score going, and then this very blue city behind him, and then a character like stepping out on a smoky balcony. And I swear, I don't know if that's an intentional reference to Blade Runner, but it evoked it so much to me, which was pleasing, just like aesthetically. And then also, it's a very kind of Captain Jack in Torchwood type thing. Like Luther's standing out over like a tall balcony, and he's looking over the city, and we can literally like voyeuristically see into all these windows, similar to like the scary home invasion stuff with the last sequence, where we can see into all these places. And so Luther's like the city's protector, looking out like Captain Jack across the city, and we can see into everything, and it's all blue and the piano's going, and then Mary comes out. I found it a very engulfing kind of sequence. I don't know if it stood out to you guys at all, but I was quite enraptured with it.
They do like stuff where Luther climbs up and is quite high up, don't they? Like there's a sequence in episode 2 where he climbs on the van and sort of looking out over everyone.
Yeah. It's funny that this is John's go-to thing after Schenk tells him to leave the office for the night. His go-to, instead of being able to actually protect the city, is doing the symbolic thing where he feels like he's protecting, that he's watching over the city. Yeah,
because in earlier series we had him and Ian standing up, over the top of the city. And then I guess even when he was obsessed with where Manson fell, that's still being in a really high up spot. He likes the verticality, I guess. Being on top of things, I guess it's like I'm looking out and protecting, and it's kind of a narcissistic-y thing, but it's also kind of a policey watchfulness thing, and I guess he just feels comfortable up high as well. Yeah, it's an interesting trait. And it also just looks good visually, of course.
Yeah, I think a lot of the highlights of Luther are when they make the world feel a little bit unreal. So like this, you compared it to Blade Runner, for example. I love those infusions of like different genres kind of coming in, and the city not quite feeling realistic, but more like a place of fantasy, like all the gothic vibes, like Luther's ridiculous kind of vampire castle that he lives in, and all those things. I think those are kind of the things that make Luther fun.
I know the director of the first two-parter of Series 3 did all of Series 2 and one episode in Series 1, but I felt the visuals here caught my attention even more. He did so much stuff where the camera felt very active and kind of not literally point of view, but very like in kind of Luther's perspective. It was moving around a lot. Like he did lots of the great epic London shots as well, but I felt it was very active. It was moving around. We have so many of those like tracking shots where like Luther walks through an office and like we stay in the one perspective. I love all that because I just feel like the camera's really getting you in Luther's brain. Like you feel kind of harried the way he does, as we're in the same shot, but he's moving over here and then he's dealing with that and then he's dealing with this. I feel like the camera work does a really good job of kind of aligning with Luther's own perspective in the show. A lot of the show comes together. Like there's bits of it that don't work, but just aesthetically, I think it works on a level not every show like this does. I liked also another episode one thing when Luther and Ripley are investigating that guy. Guess he liked to sit in a room and slag people off on the internet. Guy was a troll. And then what is this Nazi Russia? There was some fun stuff in that first episode.
Just generally in the show, in this series, across both the first and second stories, I like the sort of like camp, sort of pseudo Black Mirror kind of rubbish internet kind of approach to it, like the troll, or like the hashtag hang him, like hangthepedo.com, click this link. So very like early internet kind of vibes. It's very fun.
Well, I think Cross is genuinely interested, I think, in this stuff. He doesn't fully understand some of it, but I like that he's interested in this intersection between media and vigilantism and social media and everything. Like Schenk says he doesn't understand social networking, but they all talk about it a lot. And like, you know, in series 2, we had the live webcam killings with the Punch and Judy killer. And then in series 3, we have like Marwood advertises, you know, my website's coming online in 2 hours. And then there's votes and there's like streams and everything. I like that even if he doesn't get it, maybe with the same verisimilitude, someone more attuned to the technologies might. I like that he is actually interested in it and he's not like dismissing it. He's trying to put the contemporary and actually understand how it intersects with crime and stuff. I think it's endearing.
It also adds to the sense of Luther being slightly out of time. I noticed in the first episode of this series, he's making these 80s like boomer references that people don't understand, you know, he's like his favourite, you know, music and shit. I think that's quite an interesting aspect of him. Like he's not exactly a modern kind of figure. You know, he does seem sort of, he has this nostalgia. He's not down with the kids, which is kind of an interesting position for like the hero of the show to be in.
I have found myself thinking before there should, or there ought to come a point where Luther, the character, where John Luther realizes that he's out of date, that he's had his day, and that the world has moved on, and the police work has moved on, and his approach to things is not viable anymore. So I think that's an approach that he feels out of date for 2010. So he certainly, I think, will feel out of date in 2023.
Well, I know the 2023 film, the Andy Serkis antagonist is meant to be some sort of cyber stalking expert or something. So it'll be interesting to see if this sort of stuff gets confronted more there. Something else I like in Series 3 is, you know, when Luther goes and he busts the operation against him, Ripley's there and it's like awkward. Ripley, have you betrayed me? And then Luther listens to the tape and it's, Luther is the bestest detective ever and I love him and I defend him and everything. And Idris gets to like the surprise and like the joy on his face. And then the start of the next episode, he's so warm to Ripley. He's inviting them in so he can meet Mary. Of course, that's setting up plot stuff to happen later that they know each other. But it's just, there's so much love there. And he flat out says, you know, that it's his mate. He's my mate and I love him. What do you think of the very warm Luther towards Ripley after he hears the tape?
I think it's really sweet. I like the effect that Mary has on him, and I like that his ego has been stroked a little bit by Justin, and then, you know, he got to spend the night with Mary, and he's got like a nice pixie girlfriend, as Alice refers to her, and this is John at his happiest probably ever, where he gets to have his friend and his girlfriend, and it's quite fun. It plays as a funny moment. With him inviting him into the home, and Justin and Mary sort of being a bit, hello, right, and John trying to sort of force these two together, like these are my two favourite people in the world to meet.
I think there's something inherently quite entertaining whenever John is happy, because he spends so much of the show being this angsty, brooding, you know, dark, tortured soul. So like whenever there's something very strange and uncanny when he's sort of being bubbly and happy and cracking jokes and kind of being silly. It's extremely entertaining. So I love that. Although I found just the sheer simping of Ripley on that tape, I was like, oh my god, dude, what the fuck? How can you be so devoted to just covering up everything bad Luther's ever done? It's like crazy. Like just the way in which it really drives home how Luther has been enabled by everyone around him, just never ever holding him accountable. Really quite impressive. It doesn't feel very heroic.
The Justin, come in. That scene reminds me a lot of the Capaldi and Clara dynamic that Moffat did sometimes, where Capaldi would smile at her or say a nice thing or give her something, and she'd go, "Why are you being nice?" It's the same beat.
Yeah, and he graduates to Justin. You've got to move on and make little Ripleys of your own. I read that as, I think, Tyler, did you read that as you've got to make kids of your own? I read it as you've got to go be you've got to have my rank and you've got to have your own little adoring fans to follow you around.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, no, I did read it as kids. I read it as like, move up the ranks in the job and have little baby Ripleys with somebody. And
well, it can be both.
Yeah, and I suppose it can be. Yeah, I read it that way. I think because I was expecting something to happen with the Grey story. So I do believe that the intent there was for you as viewer to make the connection between Justin and Grey, and Justin rising in the ranks and settling down with somebody and having kids.
Yeah, I would say that came off to me when he was talking about moving up the ranks and have your little Ripleys. It did feel a lot like he was talking about simulate the relationship that Luther has with Ripley, but with Ripley in the Luther position and him having his own Ripleys. That's how it felt to me, almost in the sense that Ripley being like a surrogate son to him in some bizarre way.
Yeah.
The Mary stuff goes south pretty quickly though, because George Stark and Erin show her a bunch of files and they meet out in public. How did your wife die? We should stay apart. What do we think of Alice's analysis of Mary, where it's that Mary's what you want to want, not what you actually want, which is me. You want but what is Mary? She's a very accepting, like doesn't mind that John still loves Zoe. She thinks that's normal and not a problem. I don't think she's boring the way some characters are, but she's kind of not dramatic. What do we think of Alice's analysis?
With the Mary and John dynamic, I find it really genuine and sweet and realistic that she says to him, "You still speak with love in your voice," and he very openly admits, "Yeah, I do, yeah," and she likes it. And there's absolutely nothing wrong. Neither of them feel the need to hide from each other the way they feel about that.
Yeah, it's nice that Mary is down to earth in a way. It's not necessarily like a boring person. She's just someone who doesn't bullshit around and doesn't. I guess like she's not like judgmental. She doesn't have this need to like control Luther or do anything in particular. So he feels he can be himself around her because she isn't sort of. She is sort of accepting in that way, but also when it comes to actually. When it comes to the nature of Luther having all this kind of madness and chaos around him, that sort of kind of ruins their relationship as soon as it enters the equation.
The way that Alice is she as a character is like the character that can see through the matrix of the show's universe. She can discern anything and everything and read out. She acts as narrator and can read characters in a way that she's like a cross stand-in or a viewer stand-in. And so the conversation that she has with John about Mary is like bursting his bubble, and you can kind of see it. That's definitely the way that it's played. You can see that in John's face in the way that she's talking about Mary. That he kind of is hurt by it and frustrated by it, but understands it and recognizes it. And you can tell by in the script as well that there's not an instance where John tries to rebuke her opinion that it would never work with Mary, and she's not even what you really want. She's what you want to want.
I think what I would have liked is maybe if there were more episodes in the series, maybe rather than the whole Mary gets shown the file and she's like, oh my god, Luther, did you really do all this stuff? I would have been interested to see how Alice's assessment of Mary would show itself to be true. Like if we actually saw that relationship like organically unraveling itself, and like that Luther's kind of sort of narcissistic problem kind of coming in, because I feel like he almost doesn't get to. Like Alice says, okay, this would never work, and we just have to accept it. We don't really see like almost a proof positive of that, which is, I think, it's kind of a shame. But I think it would have been nice to see how it would spool out naturally by itself. But at the same time, I don't think it's particularly off base.
There's a couple of Alice characterization things I want to talk through. Well, first, some stuff Ruth Wilson herself said.
I think Alice is really loyal to Luther because there's an affinity with him. Which she's never had with anyone. And it's a cat and mouse game between the two, and she desperately misses that from her life. And I think Luther probably misses it too. And it's always the idea of what if there's something more. And I think that she cares for him deeply, actually, and she's never done that before. So she's willing to take risks and to come back and protect him. And also she wants to get what she wants, which is him. And can't really bear the thought of him existing in a world where she doesn't exist or she's not present. She sort of feels that she is essential to his life and he is to hers. The last time you see her, Luther has obviously helped her out, helped her escape, and she's gone off because she's on the run. She's gone off to various places around the world, and you get the sense that she's been sending information back to him, telling him where she is, and she's always said to him, why don't you join me? We're equals, we are similar beings. And I think she's coming back to try and lure him out again. And knowing what he's been up to and the situation he's in and how many other people have lost their lives, including his very close friends, she's like, now's the time to leave. This isn't the place for you. Join my fun world. It's much more interesting to live this side of the law rather than that side. It's a complete joy working with Idris. In comparison to a lot of people I've worked with, or, it's always very hard working with anyone else after you work with him because he's so easy. We've got such a rapport, there's such an ease with chemistry and what's there, and he's very natural and changes it every time you work with him. Every scene is different and every take is different, so it always feels fresh and new. And I think the two of us, we kind of giggle a lot on set. There's a lot of we just find it hilarious, and we find this sort of relationship hilarious. So there's a joy to it and an excitement and a slight hysteria over the silliness of it. But also, we really enjoy each other's company. We're good friends, so it works.
So that's Ruth's take on Alice. Any thoughts there first?
I think the affinity between them is very clear in the show, even though like the nature of what that is kind of it's always kind of amorphous. Like it's like it's sort of an unspoken, kind of unspeakable, sort of undefinable kind of complicit nature between them. It's something in both of them draws them to the other, and it's that sort of magnetic ambiguity that makes it so interesting.
My favourite thing with Alice this season is, so Alice says she's been in Berlin and she's got the passports ready for Luther to run away with her and everything, and they have this conversation where she says she got married. Does it add a tingle of the illicit to the conversation? I got married to Bertrand at a conference in Sao Paulo. He was intensely intellectual. Sadly, he passed away. Some little girls grow up wanting ponies. I always wanted to be a widow. And I find that all totally believable. Yeah, Alice could have been off in Germany. Yeah, she could have married some intellectual guy. She probably would have liked the intellectual engagement. Also, wanting to be a widow, that's very her. The circumstances of this Bertrand's death are left vague, but you wonder, don't you? So that's all pretty typical Alice characterization. That's not surprising at all, any of that. But the really interesting thing is later it gets undercut. Luther says, I saw the receipt for your boots. You've not been in Germany all this time. None of this Berlin bullshit. You've been in London for weeks. And so she's kind of deflated, and she admits, I wanted something, you. And so Luther tries to bring up Mary, and she's like, get real. That's not a real thing. You and I are. And it kind of trails off there. I love that Alice kind of gets pierced. It's more human kind of there. She's like lying to big up herself. It's like a classic X thing, isn't it? Oh, I've been great. I've been off in been with this person who's better than, I've been off with this really impressive person, and I've been doing this, and I've been there, and I've been that, and, all these great things. Oh no, actually, I've been trailing around, thinking about you. What do you guys think of that stuff? And also, so do you believe Bertrand was real at all? Do you believe she went to Berlin and just came to London earlier? Or do you believe none of that Berlin stuff happened? What's your read on all that?
I take that line, again, to reference Moffat, Doctor Who, and also because, Gig, you referred to Alice as being similar to Doctor Who as a character earlier. I do kind of take half of the anecdotes that Cross sprinkles in for Alice with a pinch of salt, in the same way that Moffat likes to do with his Doctor Who, where they will talk about prior adventures they've had, or in Alice's case, maybe prior murders, and you kind of have to think, maybe this happened, maybe this didn't really happen. It's just a fun, enigmatic thing that Alice likes to do, and Cross likes to do for Alice. I love that what it sets up, though, is that Luther can read Alice in the same way that Alice can read Luther. Luther sees through her, and he's capable of recognizing. Obviously, it's quite a he uses quite a proactive approach to discover the truth. He uses a detective approach where he finds a material piece of evidence to disprove her. But I think what really is being said here is that John can read her. John understands her in the same way that we see time and time again, every time Alice crops up in the show, that she reads John. And frustratingly, to John, explains to him who he really is, oftentimes in ways that he doesn't want to hear. In this case, John gets to do the same to her. He gets to prove her humanity to her, that he sees her in a way that nobody else sees her, and she doesn't want to be seen. Yeah,
the fact that Alice is trying to hide from Luther somewhat, the fact that she's here specifically for him, and she's there out of a desire to see him, to whisk him away, I think that is quite interesting, because she's always this character who is hiding the vulnerabilities that she may have somewhat. She's always putting on this this sort of front. So it's really, I think it shows how close Luther actually is to her heart, that she didn't really want to give away just how focused on him she was. That she's kind of projecting this idea of, oh, I'm just this mischievous adventuress, and I've just stopped by to help you, in your your pitiable state that you're in. But the truth is that no, she is here specifically out of an interest in him specifically. It's just that really interesting thing. It gives her more of a dimension. I think it puts her on a level that's more interesting than just the chaotic, manic, pixie, evil, imp figure. And it makes her more interesting.
It's also it shows Cross is quite attuned to the character as well, because it's vastly more interesting a dynamic for Alice to specifically swoop into John's life when he needs her, because she was already there, because she already was conscious of what was happening, as opposed to she's this mystical mystical whimsical character who is capable of turning up, helping him fix things, and leaving again, his guardian angel, so to speak. She wants to be seen as that, but is not. And John has discovered by season 3 that that's not really what she is. She is just human and in love.
There's that line Luther has to Ripley about Erin, but it can apply elsewhere, that the thing about love is that it brings out the best in you, but it can also bring out the worst. All your fears, rage, self-doubt, don't mess around with it. It'll blow up in your face. And Erin says, are you done? And then she looks a bit spooked or unsure when Luther walks away. But I guess all that love stuff can apply to Alice and whatnot as well.
I mean, that almost paraphrases something Alice said to Luther in series 1. How can it be love if all it does is make you lonely and corrupt? Love is supposed to exalt us, blah, 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 blah. So it does seem like almost maybe that is an echo or a reminder of that whole thing that Luther had about love making him worse rather than better.
We were talking about scary sequences earlier. Of course, the start of the second two-parter is scary as well. We've got the two friends finally kissing, and, I thought you'd never ask that sort of thing going on, and then a group of unruly men start attacking the car, and they've got out the guy and attacking, and they're surely going to sexually assault the woman afterwards. And then our Batman, our hero Marwood, comes out of nowhere, and I love that this Marwood stuff, it takes all the comic-y concerns that have been so much a part of the show, and it really bigs them up to talk about more directly. And I think Cross must have had to fight his own desires to give him some sort of mask or more distinctive outfit, because I'm sure there was a compulsion to do that there. But he comes out with his iconic shotgun and he saves the day. And that woman, when the cops are all like, oh, we've got to work out this vigilante, we've got to take care of him. She's all like, he saved me. I'm going to defend him, not help you guys. He's the one who saved me. He held my friend's hand until the ambulance arrived. He saved me from being sexually assaulted. Everything is coming up Marwood, in episode 3 for a lot of it. I think, and we get characterization for Marwood. He was an architect. He got depressed when his wife died. He was in hospital for a while. Then the gun club, martial arts, urban survival, like he was training for the zombie apocalypse. Originally, he's a formidable foe, and there's that river confrontation we talked about earlier when we're not so different, you and I. There's that kind of understanding going on. I think things are going really well for Marwood for a while, and seeing the pedophile hanged in that, obviously a huge amount of people are going to support that. Even when the cops bring out that woman who was victimized by the pedophile when she was a young girl, even she, doesn't obey the cops, and she says, kill him, you should kill him.
The worst plan in human history. Let's have this woman relive her trauma in the hope that what were they thinking? Seriously.
It was insanely unempathetic, just ridiculous plan from the cops and all the men in charge of that. But so I think there's a lot of viewers are going to be rooting for Marwood for, I think, a lot of this two-parter. Where I think he really cocks it up is when there's a really clear line to what he's doing, and it's a very simple morality. I think he's on much better footing. Like, there was a pedophile and he got free of prison too quickly. That's bad. He might hurt someone again. When it's all that kind of stuff, I think he's on pretty solid grounding. It's when he gets tied into these convoluted plots, like, well, I have to kidnap this woman, to get here, to get to there, and so I can accomplish this and to accomplish that. And when he starts to get tied in knots with the police as well, and you can't film me, I film you. I think for comic book morality, it's got to be comic book morality. It's got to be super simple. Otherwise, people will turn on you because it'll confuse them, and then you're just going to look like a criminal as well, as it does when he shoots Ripley and then he's a cop killer and the media turn on him. I think he overcomplicated things and he got his own narcissism and personality into it too much. I think if he really wanted to just save people, he could have done it a very different way.
You know what that does remind me of? There is a speech that Luther has to Mary when he's trying to kind of explain and justify himself, where he talks about his past actions like he's in control of a car and it's skidding out of control and he's trying to lean into the thing. So I think that whole thing you've just described with Marwood, I think it is meant to be almost a cracked mirror of how Luther's own attempts to do good end up getting him into deeper and deeper shit. But at the same time, I think Marwood stuff is somehow like worse probably because Luther's never just like straight up unloaded a shotgun into someone, it's that kind of thing. So I think the mirroring isn't entirely complete, but I think the intention is there.
That scheme to have a victim of the paedophile beg for his life on TV, that was John's idea. That was something that you get a very short piece of dialogue of Schenk saying something like, upstairs has sanctioned this, go ahead with it, but on your head be it, sort of thing. And John says, yes, it will definitely work. And of course it doesn't work, and it's a terrible idea, as you say. And then you have that moment bleed right into John taking a beating to save Anonce's life, and it just is it reads so ridiculously for John's sense of morality, which is, it's proven at this point it's not thorny in the way that it has been for the last couple of seasons. It's clearly nonsense. It's corrupt. His sense of morality is it's unbelievable. And this, I remember in the season 1 discussion that we had, my thesis statement was that the person who has the character who has the best read on John is, of course, Zoe, and that she has this line where she says, had he read a different book at a different time in his life, he would have been a different man, and that John has this malleability, or had a malleability to him, where he was not a person whose values were set in stone, but somebody who could be influenced. And my theory on that was that that was because he was is a narcissist. He's somebody that feels he's a narcissist with a strong sense of empathy, or whether that's innate or something that he creates. His empathy rules him. his feelings rule him, and he feels a need to enact justice for others, for the safety of others. He feels that he has to be the savior of others, that's something that really gets played with in this two-parter, because the morality that John has picked up through his life is so questionable and so untenable that it fails here. He completely fails in his duty, and ends up saving the life of somebody whose life doesn't deserve to be saved, and ends up putting somebody through trauma who didn't need to be put through that trauma. And he's enacting a very skewed sense of morality. And Alice says this to him in episode 4. She says that she has this line where she says, "You assert a fabulous moral conscience,
adherence to unwritten law.
Yet time and time again it devastates. Yet time and time again it devastates the people you claim to hold dear, but you don't stop."
Your conscience has killed more people than I have.
Indeed.
Although in episode 3, interestingly, the whole sort of skewed morality regarding the paedophile and stuff there, it seems to be shared by Luther's colleagues. I think there's a rather interesting line of dialogue where I think it's Schenk is talking to John, and he says, well, if we let him do this public hanging...
About the not so much necessarily about Luther, but about the police.
Yeah, it says when Schenk has this line of dialogue where he talks to Luther and says, well, if we let him go ahead with this hanging, then it might lead to lynchings and pogroms. And I think there's something really fascinating about just making the link between like a paedophile getting executed and like racism. And I think there is a kind of intriguing sense of like what is the sort of the moral baseline here in terms of like I guess the police force, which is generally the police characters in the show, and what we're kind of intended to consider as like the baseline for morality. It's very intriguing, I think, because the thing is the sense of like, well, we can't just go back to like bread and circuses and public hangings and stuff and just brutality and everyone taking the law into their own hands and blah 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 blah. I think there is a sympathetic element to that, but like the way in which it manifests as like, let's save the nonce to stop, I don't know, whatever the fuck. It's like, I think it does inevitably come off as incredibly skewed, like we've said. So Luther doesn't seem to be alone in this weird morality that he has, basically.
There's so much interesting stuff going on there. One is, like, the first episode of the show is Luther doesn't save a bad guy, even though he should, because he knows this guy's done so much stuff that's bad. So it's interesting to kind of link in the Madsen stuff to here. 2, that exchange, so that starts with the social media jokes. It's Schenk saying, do you understand social networking? No, good, then I'm not alone. People are trying to incite the pedo's execution. Luther says, like Gig said, bread and circuses, nothing new under the sun. And then Schenk fearmongers with, if Marwood gets his wish, people vote to hang the pedophile, and they will, for who would suffer a pedophile to live? Then there's no ending where there's no telling where this is going to end. Riots, copycat murders, lynchings, pogroms, gangs of vigilantes kicking to death people whose faces don't fit. I wonder at how... I don't know what Cross's own opinion is there, but I think it does say a lot of interesting stuff about the police, that they have this kind of moral insanity or moral nonsense, or at least moral convolutions, similar to Marwood, who gets in his own moral convolutions. It makes me think of 2 American stories, or this dichotomy between Marwood and Luther's moral convolutions we've been talking about. One is The Wire, where so much of that show is kind of suggesting that the police force in the show's vision can be seen as kind of a gang, essentially. It's government sanctioned, but it's essentially a gang very comparable to the other gangs, and all institutions you could call them, because the show kind of accords a lot of the drug dealer society the same way, but essentially a kind of gang fueled by narcissists, where the drive to take down, the drug dealers or whatever isn't driven by an outrage over drugs. Like The Wire is quite explicit over the lunacy it finds in the war on drugs in the first place. And, some of the cop characters, accord with this, agree with this. But this just desire to triumph over the other people. It's an intellectual exercise. I think there's a lot of Luther comparisons you can make there. The main Wire character, Detective McNulty, there's loads done there where it's just this narcissist drive to triumph over like the intellectual puzzle boxes more than it is any empathetic thing, you could argue. So I think there's a lot of stuff there that's similar. But also Batman, in that a lot of Batman stories, and sometimes the narrative's aware of this and characters lampshade it, and sometimes it's not. A lot of the times, Batman will have like a rule, I can't kill people, or at least he'll have a rule, I can't kill the big important enemies like the Joker. And so Batman will get in these insane situations where he's doing, like sometimes he's very obviously killing people, but like the film or the comic just doesn't dwell on it because they're not named people, and he's killing people to go save the Joker who I can't actually kill. Or he'll just be doing similar, just moral insanity to try and get the Joker into prison, which he knows the Joker's going to escape from. It's basically moral nonsense storytelling that we kind of understand because it's such a normal form of storytelling for like comic book characters. But I think both those kinds of moralities, the nonsense comic morality of saving the criminal even where it makes increasingly less sense, at least to keep saving them in the same ways, and that kind of American storytelling, police just as a sanctioned gang of narcissists kind of thing. I think this two-parter with Marwood and Luther played with a lot of similar ideas.
It's fascinating that in this case with the paedophile hanging, the police are trying to race to stop an idea from getting out. Like, if it, rather, it's not so much about stopping the crime in particular, as it is about stopping everyone seeing the crime and inspiring people and getting like the wrong idea out there. It's quite fascinating. Although something that's maybe not acknowledged is that the police storming in to prevent the hanging and Luther getting beaten up by everyone and everyone seeing that in its own way is just a different idea getting sort of shown to everyone instead. It's kind of fascinating. It's just like it, in the same sense that the villain of this arc is like a cracked mirror of Luther and kind of trying to be almost the logical conclusion of Luther in a way, the killer who is the hero. At the same time, it's sort of like this sense that rather than an actual serial killer in this case, it's just the police are trying to stop like something that is bigger than them, this actual like abstract concept from escaping. It sort of feels like the final boss of Luther in some ways is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah. Tyler, any thoughts?
Yeah, I was looking at the. I was wondering why Cross chose the name Tom Marwood. I discovered that Tom comes from a Hebrew word meaning twin, and Marwood is. I mean, this one's a bit of a leap, but the twin one is interesting. But Marwood comes from the name. Malreward, I think I remember reading, which is French. Mal obviously meaning bad as a prefix, and reward being regard, meaning look. So Malreward means to cast an evil eye, to cast a bad eye, a bad glance, evil glance. But I certainly think Tom as twin is really interesting. If Neo, your hypothesis is that he's a reflection of John.
Well, you bring up etymology like Mary does, because she derives Luther's name German, equating to People's Army.
As People's Army, yeah.
And it's a People's Army that kind of goes and cheers on the hanging of the pedophile. I love how there's this great exchange. I really love this sequence. It's kind of a narrative breakdown thing where it reminds me, in Series 2's first two-parter, the Punch and Judy guy, when Luther just stops talking to the Punch and Judy killer when he's unmasked and he just talks to the kid instead, and it just breaks down the whole narrative of the spooky Punch and Judy guy, and he just shrivels up into a corn cob, basically, because he can't deal with not being afforded any respect. I feel a kind of similar vibe when Alice starts filming Marwood, and he's like, you can't film me, I film them.
I'm in charge here.
Yeah, he's just kind of waving around. He has no idea how to kind of respond to this situation. And he has this super pathetic exchange with Luther where he's like, you can't hold me accountable if you choose not to listen, when he's trying to justify like killing Ripley, saying that's not my fault, it's because you didn't do what I said. Or he didn't do what I said. And so Luther says, I can hold you accountable because, I'm the police. I thought that was a fun scene.
Alice, in the final scene of the season, asks what came of Marwood. And John says he's alive and suffering. And Alice says good, which obviously indicates growth on her part for agreeing now with John's original sentiment with Ian that it would have been better for him to be alive in prison and suffer than to die. I think, Neo, you and I disagreed with that sentiment. We agreed that dying is worse. We agreed with Alice. But it's interesting now that by season 3, she's adopted John's approach.
It's interesting that John actually successfully gets to condemn someone to life this time. You know, it's actually put into his hands, whereas he sort of tried with Ian and the decision was taken away from him. In this case, we get that scene of him sort of pressing down on Marwood's wound on his neck and saying, well, hey, I'll let you die if you tell me what I want. Just kidding. You gotta live, you suck. I think in this case it is because
yeah, I love that line, not on your Nelly, it's great.
Yeah, I think in this case it is because the guy in question is so desperate to die because he's fucked everything up so badly, and also he wants to somehow feel like his death means something as relates to his dead wife, right? Too. So it's it's interestingly earlier on in the episode, Luther says, "Okay, well, I will deprive him of his martyrdom, and that's the cruelest thing I can think of." So when he's plotting away with Alice and kind of being his crueler self, which I kind of loved. So it's the whole thing of condemning Marwood to life. It's maybe not just in the sense that a question of whether dying is worse or living is worse or whatever, but in this case, it's specifically because Marwood so dearly wanted to die and means something in dying that denying him death is not just the better thing to do generally, but just because it's specifically it's a good sort of revenge against this guy from Luther's point of view.
I think in terms of Marwood screwing things up, he has this line towards the end where he's doing the whole rooftop escalation with Mary, Alice, Luther. It's ugly, isn't it? Being impotent, being degraded by a violent man that you'll never get to punish. I think he really screwed up getting, this sounds so silly, getting too personal with his vigilantism. He was making so much of it like a psychological, I felt bad this way, so I'm going to make everyone else feel bad this way, which just counteracts his bigger vigilante goals and morality stuff and, want for a referendum. I think it's all undercut by he gets too personal and then he does these evil little scenarios where he's just trying to hurt people the way he was hurt. When you think of successful vigilantes, or in fictionally, like Batman or Spider-Man or whatever, they're not specifically going out and just trying to make people feel bad the way they felt bad. Batman isn't trying to make more orphans, and he's not even just trying to go kill more street killers or whatever that killed his parents. And Spider-Man's not just going out trying to kill whoever were the type of person to kill his uncle. They go out and they do more comic booky, straightforward, I'm trying to stop evil things happening. I'm going to stop, more general crimes or supervillains or whatever. And Marwood, I think he tries for that a bit in episode 3 at least, but then he gets too sidetracked into these big convolutions and then just trying to hurt people the way he's been hurt. For all the martial arts training and everything he did, I don't think he was cut out to be a superhero. But the big rooftop escalation is a kind of blockbustery sequence, isn't it? Where you've got to choose one. You've got to choose Alice or you can choose Mary and, I'm going to kill the other. What did you guys think of that whole deal?
I love the way Wilson plays that scene.
I always thought ever since it first aired back then, I was always thinking this is more about the themes regarding Luther than it is Marwood as a character, because I think we're sort of derailing whatever character Marwood is to get it into this situation that's about Luther and his life and his choices, which I completely get the intentionality of the story there, and I think I sort of love it in its own bizarre way. But just in terms of how it relates to Marwood's storyline, it's okay, whatever, okay, he's just being put in this position so we can get this scene here and we can have these three characters, Luther, Alice, and Mary, where they are. Marwood starts to matter less, I think, in the scheme of things.
Wilson plays this scene as Alice defeated and scared for the first and only time that I can think of.
Yeah,
which is really fascinating because it's not really John. You could argue this, but I think it's not really John that saves her because there's this line again in the very final scene while the credits are being intercut. Where she says to John, "That was a good plan." Saying that you would shoot me. That worked out really well, didn't it? And I don't think, maybe he says yes, or maybe he doesn't say anything, but he looks down, he looks away, which kind of implying that it wasn't really a plan. He was genuinely saying, "Shoot Alice, save Mary." So it wasn't John that saved Alice, despite what she may think. It was Mary.
I love that because I think it ties into all the cops and other paternal figures get these kind of ideas of how we can use people who've been victimized or what they're going to do, but it's not really thinking through what they're actually going to feel. We saw it with the character in the press conference with Schenk. I love that Mary is why would I condemn Alice? She saved my life. Like, tangibly, she helped me out. I like all that kind of stuff there. It's so interesting because it's Mary saves Alice. When Marwood goes to shoot Alice, Mary, goes for the gun, and that allows Alice to kill Marwood. So it's the teamwork there. I love that the people who've been victimized don't just act passively in this series, and the cops kind of wrongfully assume how they're going to act in some ways. I like all that stuff.
In a way, it's almost like only by using Mary in that way and kind of embroiling Mary into like the violence and like the chaos and kind of relying on her to have to step in. Only in that way can Luther get what he wants. He has his cake and eat it too. Both women survive, but only because Mary is kind of almost tainted, by sort of having to like reach in and like grab the gun and like risk her own life and all that stuff. So that's kind of like the tragedy of it in a way. Like they both survive. Luther kind of wins, but it's in this kind of tainted way where Mary has sort of been dragged in, if you see what I mean. And I think maybe that reads to Alice as like a terribly clever manipulation, a plan. But at the same time, it's sort of on Luther's side. It's sort of like a submission in a way. He's sort of giving up, but also in a way, kind of he's sort of losing in some ways because he's saying, "Okay, shoot Alice," and either that happens and he loses Alice, or Mary kind of saves Alice and he kind of loses Mary. Do you see what I mean? It's like a catch-22 that he's in.
I have two thoughts there, one on Marwood and one on Luther. So the first is, when Luther said Alice, I think, at least Tyler, I think you had the same thought I had there. When he said Alice, I thought he meant save Alice.
Same. I
was like, whoa, that's a big move, Cross. And then no, it's shoot Alice.
That's interesting. You both thought that then. I wonder if that then was the intentional.
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
Reaction because he says Alice, and then there's a beat, and then he says, shoot Alice.
Yeah.
And also Alice looks up as well, doesn't she? Alice sort of looks up and smiles a bit. So I wonder whether that was played as Alice also thinking that he was saving her.
And the other thought I had with Marwood, like Gig is saying, feeling him kind of mechanically maneuvered around in the narrative just to be like the antagonistic force for this setup at the end. I wonder if he hadn't shot Ripley, and if we tweaked his characterization a bit to be less self-defeating, I wonder what that would have been like. A more pure Marwood as the villain for the finale. I have no idea how that would work, but a Marwood that wouldn't have shot Ripley, I think could have been interesting, because it would have, I guess, forced some of the vigilante themes to be dealt with more. Because Marwood is, in some ways, he's treated like, well, to bring it back to superheroes, a lot of superhero movies will have a villain who's like an environmentalist or like a crusader against racism or something. I'm thinking Killmonger in Black Panther or Orm in Aquaman, and it's a sort of villain that the audience is going to be like nodding their heads and going, yeah, at least for the start, look, like, these ideas make sense. I hate racism too. I hate pollution in the ocean as well. But then they do something out of nowhere that's just nuts. They kill a kid, or they just do something insanely evil, and the audience is like, right, no, they are bad. Forget what they were spouting, and let's let our superhero conserve the status quo and scrap them. Marwood, I wonder, is he a bit like that? And like, was he making too much of a point that we had to have him kill Ripley? What do you guys think of that equivalence?
I think vigilantism always gets too big, too noisy, doesn't it? I think that's just something that's the way that vigilantism is. That's the way that vigilantism works. And I think you can only believe that vigilantism can work if, and this is quite a thorny topic to get into because it's political ideology, but I think you can only think that works as an anarchist. And that is something that the majority of people in Western society do not agree with, even people on the far left in many cases. And I think that I think less than it being a Thanos type of thing, like a Marvel type of thing, it's just a commentary on what happens when people try to take justice into their own hands without some sense of social order, be it perfect or not.
Yeah, I don't think Cross takes Marwood's whole thing of like, death penalty, vigilante justice seriously in a way that something like Black Panther maybe takes racism kind of seriously. I don't think he's really taking it that seriously, but I think the basic structure that you outlined there with the villain does something where we just completely stop sympathising with him completely. I think that is there, but I think the the reason that Marwood kind of unspools into just this self-defeating kind of pathetic dude is that there's not really the show isn't that interested in really seriously trying to engage with the moral question of like, should we just have vigilante justice everywhere? Because I think it's kind of not really bothered about trying to like answer that question. Maybe partially because the hero of the show is already, so often taking the law into his own hands. So it's kind of almost given up any right to kind of like come down either side on that question. So it takes more of an interest in just getting into the character stuff and having Marwood be like a foil to Luther who ruins Luther's life in some way.
I kind of wish it had confronted it more. I don't think Cross was getting super political, but it's kind of confused. Like, Marwood calls on the state, like he uses those words a few times, and then he wants a referendum. So it's kind of like
Brexit.
At the start, I was thinking, is he like, and then he's going, well, I want a nice and orderly referendum for the people to decide on this issue.
This is that's the type of person that Marwood is supposed to be, isn't it? He's the I referred earlier to him as a Guardian reader gone rogue.
Yeah,
he's supposed to be. He's like the type of neoliberal 2010 London liberal elite type of character who goes through a crisis and takes matters into his own hands. But that type of character is only a leap away from fascism. That's what Marwood is.
I think what makes him more of a superhero molded character than a supervillain molded character is he isn't trying to topple the system, is he? He keeps he's a reformist. Basically, he keeps saying the system was meant to, keep these men in prison, like not kill these men even a lot of times. He says they're meant to stay locked away, but the system's failed. And so his call on referendum, it really seems to me like he's trying to incite public, policy change more than he's trying to incite anything revolutionary. I think that's actually really interesting because in a way you'd think it would make him more sympathetic, at least for this sort of show, than an outright, I'm an anarchist and I want, let's tear the world down kind of thing. So I kind of wish more had been done because I think he's a really interesting, Guardian reader gone rogue. I think it's a more interesting kind of antagonist than just a more straightforward, I want to change everything.
It's quite a fascinating take on liberal approaches to radicalism in the sense that the easiest approach for what Marwood is going for, which I think is, like you're saying, it's basically like a Caitlin's law type of thing. Rather than lobbying Parliament, which is the typical way to get that kind of thing, that's how these things happen. Is a year or two of lawyers and scandals coming out about politicians and such. His approach to doing that is violent and anarchistic, but not rooted in anything. He's taking the democratic established system and still believing in it, but trying to shake it up, but also sustain it.
Yeah, you mentioned, I think, Neo, the word you used earlier was confused, and Tyler, you just said it's not rooted in anything. It reminds me, during the river confrontation in episode 3, I think Marwood mentions how 1 in 5 murders are committed by men on bail, blah, 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 blah. They talk about bail specifically. So why does that work? Why can people just pay to be free or whatever and stuff? And then in part 4, he says, let's have a referendum on the death penalty. So, and I think there's quite a big difference between let's get rid of, say, the bail system or whatever, versus let's bring back executing criminals rather than having them in prison. I think that sense of just the lack of overall coherence and just generally kind of flinging spaghetti at the wall and just having a wild sense of okay, I want this, but also I want this and this and this. I think it's the lack of a clear ideological core to who he is and what he wants, I think, there.
Yeah, there's nothing cohesive to him, and you sort of get the impression that had he had a stronger sense of what ought to be done to achieve his means, like if he were to rally up a cult, as he sort of does, he rallies up a mob. Had he directed them to Parliament and said, now we storm Parliament, that would have perhaps achieved the things that he was looking to achieve. But what he does is rally up a mob and then say, and then what? Now we sign some petitions. I don't know what does he want them to do? We're going to kill a paedophile and tweet up our MP.
He's a vigilante, not a revolutionary, I think is the thing, which I do think is interesting. It's he gets compared to like a doomsday prep. He gets compared to a zombie apocalypse, like obsessive. And of course, there's lots of men like that who get really fixated on these ideas of what if. And sometimes it's the more out there, like zombie apocalypse ideas. Sometimes it's the less out there, nuclear wasteland, or just some kind of national devastation is going to happen, and it's going to be up to me and my tins of beans, to Rorschach this shit out. I feel like that's a very specific. I imagine lots of people, maybe most people, know someone like that to some extent. So I think that's a really interesting, the kind of individualist survival. Like it says he does urban survival courses. I think that type of character is really interesting. I find Marwood so interesting. I wish there'd be even more of him, because even when he kind of gets a little less interesting maybe, or more pathetic in the finale, I think it's a very interesting character cross-thought up here, even if some bits of him maybe weren't thought through as much as maybe we're thinking.
And I love how the actor makes him sound like and feel so posh. I think there is something just so like prissy about him, like the way he speaks, and I think it really works for the whole theme in dialogue style of villain that Luther does. I think in his case, when he's this guy who's being terribly so like pretentious and intellectual about it, and this is on your head, blah blah blah. I think there's something really funny about it, but also very true. I love just the poshness of him.
I love that line. Now do me a favour and throw me your phone, please. It's so good.
Yeah.
There's Alice has a good read on him too, when she's talking about Marwood with Luther. What a needy little fishy, she says. And no, he's got a hero complex. He needs public opinion to justify his actions to himself. Alice asks, what's the plan, Stan? Luther says, I take away everything he wants, to avenge his wife, to be admired, to become a martyr, or to make his wife's death mean something. And Alice thinks that's quite cruel that you would take all that away from him. So I guess that gets again to the moral convolutions where Luther does some insane stuff to try and defeat Marwood. But a needy little fishy, I think, is quite accurate.
And we've been talking about Batman over and over again. Like one of the tenets of Batman is that he's incredibly rich, he's posh, right? He's this privileged guy. So in the sense, like Marwood being this kind of like guardian reader, kind of snob figure, in its own way, kind of almost connects him to Batman again.
I know that like comic fans will bring up, no, but in this comic he actually donates and he runs an orphanage or whatever. But I think an extremely core part of Batman as a character, and pretty much every major iteration, is that instead of trying to instate some kind of wide structural change that maybe in the long run could mitigate some of the circumstances that led to his parents dying, he elects to go beat up people in the street for a lot of the time instead, and sometimes to beat up other rich people with crazy gadgets as well, which is kind of it makes all the sense in the world for a very continuous stream of wacky storytelling in a city like Gotham or a city like Neil Cross's London. But it is kind of a conceited or a kind of rich, privileged kind of way to look at things. And it's like a way to vent out his own psychological grief and frustration and whatnot. And Marwood is so similar in all those ways. He's not trying to instate big structural change like we're talking about. His politics are quite confused. And he's shooting up, it's very easy to argue a lot of these men deserve at least more than they're getting from the state in terms of punishment and whatnot. But he is basically going around shooting people, or he's doing crazy schemes like with that pregnant woman, or he's engaging in like moral weird conversations with another man who wears the same outfit every day. So yeah, he's a very Batman-like figure in his flaws.
What did you guys make of John going on a bit of a tirade and commandeering phones and commandeering vehicles?
Well, it's kind of that thin line again, isn't it, between criminal and cop, in that, hey, your car, mine now.
Yeah, I think again it's part of like the fabric of Luther, that Luther just doesn't really Luther just does whatever he wants in a way. That's kind of just how he works, especially when the chips are down and shit's gotten real. He will steal anyone's car, he will steal anyone's phone, he will punch anyone, he will do anything.
Yeah, and it proves, not that we need to further proof, that Justin was right in the scrap that they did have. Justin says, it's never you, is it? You never admit to any of these things. But the truth was that Justin was right about his theory that John had called Barnaby to make him aware. And it's the same thing here. John can never admit any wrongdoing because John is always above the law because John is always right.
What do you think of Alice meeping to the series and serial HQ?
Schenk working with Alice is fun and sexy storytelling, but I don't buy it.
No, I don't either.
I accept it because it's cute, if you see what I mean. I accept it because this is entertainment, and I understand that sometimes there is a need to bend the rules of these things, and I don't take Luther as a realistic, gritty crime drama, as some might describe it. But I don't buy it. Not only in terms of realism, but in terms of Schenk's character.
But Schenk's character, yeah,
it just doesn't sit for me, and there certainly isn't enough time spent on it.
If she had a proxy go into the HQ, or if they'd met in some kind of public scenario she contrived, maybe. But then how would they have the files? Like, yeah. What do you think, Gig?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where it's way too easy. I think it's one of those things where it verges on Alice getting elevated to like the cartoon character status again, where she can do anything. Like, you know, she's like Missy in Doctor Who, like turning up, just sort of cause chaos and get away with everything. Having said that, I think it sort of coasts by on partly Ruth Wilson's performance again, because when she swoops into the room, she has that sort of like bizarre, like magnetic kind of charisma where like everything is just completely under her command, and it's almost like supernatural. The way she sort of steps in just sort of changes the atmosphere. Like like you say, it's incredibly fun and sexy storytelling, and you know, it's balmy. And I think generally the tone of that episode is increasingly bonkers, and as things escalate and escalate and escalate. So like the brazen stupidity of her walking in, just getting the files, and everyone just going along with it because we love Luther so much, we've got to save Luther. Yeah, we'll work with this murderer woman. It's all fine. Like it's I think it's sort of the show starting to break down more and more as it barrels towards its climax. Like, it's got this very single-minded fixation on getting to that ending and that conclusion. And in the pursuit of that, like some of the pillars of logic behind the series maybe start to topple.
It's quite a stark difference from Schenk's Series 1 finale feeling on Luther getting away with it, where in this finale, Alice says, "Do you not feel that we need to prove John's innocence?" Whereas in Series 1, it was Schenk that was the antagonist. It was Schenk that John and Alice were working against, conspiring against with Justin to retrieve evidence necessary to buy Luther more time.
I think if I remember rightly, at one point in the finale, I think Schenk is talking to George, and I think George says like, Luther sure has some loyal friends, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And Schenk's like, you bet he does, or something, some words to that effect. It's like literally just admitting to the fact that, like we're covering for Luther, we're brazenly corrupt. That's what we're doing.
In that sense, I can buy Schenk doing what it takes to save John. And I do think that by this point in the show, that is a believable thing to happen, because we open in season 2 with the man that's been conspiring against John in a different role, in a different job title, has now taken on a new job title, decided that he wants John, and he's going to take the risk. He's going to take on this guy that he knows to be a police force tornado, and will rely on him because he wants good police work. And they do establish a friendship and a good rapport. So it's not entirely ridiculous, which is why I accept it to the extent that I do. But I am dissatisfied with the way that it's very quickly brushed over.
I think Schenk has sort of transformed into a staple of that procedural genre where you have kind of the dad figure of the team, like the wholesome grandpa figure of the team. Like Line of Duty has this as well. You know, the guy who will always like support everyone and be friendly in the end. And it's quite a far cry from where Schenk was originally. Yeah,
I feel like the sanctity of Schenk in season 1 was that, like, he respects Luther absolutely, but he respects his job so much, which is why he's like, Luther, I like you and I like good police work, like you can do and everything, but this is my job, so I might give you a bit of a warning, but I am coming for you, was like his Series 1 characterization. And then in Series 2, he was a good boss, and, that all made sense. With Series 3 and the George, I'm sticking up for my man no matter what thing, the reason it rankles me a bit is because I thought like Schenk, like he respects Luther, but his job is like the main thing. And there it's like he's choosing Luther over his job, which I guess you can see as a progression. But
Schenk is a bit of a Chuck McGill, the law is sacred kind of character.
Yeah.
He's shed that for the sake of plot in season 3, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
In a way, it's almost like the police morality of people actually supposedly respecting the law and such is just kind of increasingly hypocritical and like falling apart. Like the more Luther has things happen to him, and people like go out of their way to protect him and defend him and stuff. It's like any sort of underpinning for any of those characters just sort of like disintegrates.
There's 3 things left I want to talk about. If you guys are more, of course, that's great. I want to talk about how this season functions as like an ending, and then there's 2 Neil Cross interviews I want to go through. First, I think especially Gig among us might have thoughts on this. Obviously, the show continues. There's a series 4, there's a series 5, 2023 film, but a lot feels quite conclusive about this series. Gig, what's your perspective on that?
Well, I should probably come out and say I am the LutherTruther. I'm starting a movement of LutherTruthers, and our belief is that Luther ended at series 3, and there are no more episodes. It's over, guys. And I think part of what contributed to that feeling that I had, like on watching this originally, that my feeling that I'd be okay if it was over here, is just the sense that not only the whole thing we get in the second 2-parter of kind of confronting a cracked mirror of Luther and kind of confronting Luther's hypocrisy and all of that and such, but the way in which throughout this series Luther is trying to rebuild his life by finding this nice woman, Mary, and that just gets completely trod all over by Alice and just completely condemned as like a complete pretense. And ultimately he finally says, okay, fuck it, I'll throw away my coat, my lucky coat that I've been clinging to all these years. I'll throw it away. I give up. I will submit to that thing Alice proposed to me in series 2. This whole thing, because Alice has been insisting over and over that Luther shouldn't be in this job. It's vampirizing him. It's destroying him. It's not working for him. He should just do what he really wants and blah 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 blah. And at the end of this series, we get that whole choose one, and the way it seems to wrap up, we get that quite sweet scene between Luther and Mary, where Mary's like basically tells him, "Go get her, John." And Luther, this lovely song starts playing in the background, Never Given to Give You Up, by the Black Keys, their cover of it. And he follows Alice, and they're lit by the sun. There's something incredibly romantic about it in a way that's gloopy, almost, like uncharacteristically gloopy for the show. But the tone escalating to such a degree, with this kind of romantic song playing in the back, and Luther and Alice almost kissing. Like, there's this way in which this almost unabashedly shippy kind of ending for Luther and Alice, in as much as it sort of feels perverse in how like fan-pleasing it is, it also feels like the fact that Luther is finally sort of doing this and kind of giving up on the pretense of being a law official, it feels like he's actually come to some sort of character arc, some sort of conclusion. And it's sort of like, well, it just sort of feels like the collapse of the show. Like, how can we possibly continue from this point without limply reversing this and going back to the status quo of Luther being a cop? I feel like once Luther has actually taken that step and run off with Alice to go have their fun honeymoon of whatever the fuck they're going to do, it just feels like the logical ending of Luther. And there is something quite almost like heavenly and beatific when he casts off the coat and he just walks off into the distance. There is like something really heartening about it, seeing Luther kind of not heal really, because we know he's going to get worse, but it's sort of taking his life in his own hands for once and just giving up on all the great burden that he's given himself all these years. So there's a way in which it feels like casting off like this great burden from his shoulders, and it feels like sort of angelic, like he's rising into the light with Alice. So it feels like the payoff of things that have been set up from in the previous 2 seasons, and it feels in a lot of way like I just feel satisfied thinking of this as where the show logically ended. And obviously there was more, and there were good things in what came later on. I'm not like I'm not in the position where I'll like condemn people for liking the later episodes, and they do end the show more conclusively in their own way. But I sort of just feel like I can just take or leave everything after this. So yeah, my 2 cents.
I suspect I'm going to be the centrist between you two here, which means I'm anticipating you, Tyler, to have the opposite view of Gig. Is that correct?
I don't entirely agree, but I wouldn't say I have the opposite view. I see season 3 of Luther as sort of the season 18 of Doctor Who, where things are starting to get a bit pat, and I think everybody's conscious of it, and in a way it's kind of baked into the story, whether by design or not, and and necessarily, in order for the series to continue, things need to be shaken up. Something needs to happen to change the state of play, as Alice would say. And I think, without going too far into it, because we will come to this in time, season 4 is that. I think season 4 is a soft reboot, and I don't think it does. I'm fully prepared to have to argue this point when we come to it, but I don't think that season 4 quite does that thing we were talking about earlier, where the cliffhanger of season 3 is just very quickly shut down and never brought up again. I think season 4 toys with it, and season 5 toys with it, in fact, in really interesting ways. So season 3 is like, it's like goodbye to all that. It's the last time we see the old approach, and I think I agree with you that it could comfortably end here, but I don't think it has to. And I think that what Cross does in order to prevent it from ending is I think his approach to continuing Luther is more interesting to me than what came before.
My thoughts are, like Gig and like Tyler, I really like Series 3. I really like this finale of Series 3 a lot. And I do also think it feels like a finale. Like it confronts a lot of Luther's own hypocrisies and ideas, and it very high stakes ending. It feels like an ending to the show. But without going into any detail, Series 5's finale, whether you like it or not, I think it feels so much more like an ending to the show, to me at least. I felt the way that ended, I felt like, yes, that's the ending to the show. Much more so than I felt with Series 3, as conclusive as Series 3 is. But Series 5 ending's not the ending of the show either, is it? It continues on to the film we haven't seen yet. We're recording this in January 2023. The film comes out later on this year. But obviously the film is to come, and I feel like, because this is in a very meta angle now, this isn't to do with the characters, this is to do with Neil Cross and Idris Elba, because the film has been talked about forever, for over a decade. I feel like the show can't end without whatever the quality or story of it's going to be without a film, because that feels like the collision between Idris Elba's, ever heightening stardom and career and what he's wanted for so long to bring Luther to the, it's partly a Netflix film, but it still is coming to cinemas, to bring Luther to the cinema screen. So I really like Series 3's finale, and I think it is very finale-ish, and I understand the LutherTruther movement, but I also feel like Series 5's finale, whether one likes it more or less than Series 3 finale, feels more like a finale to me, but also it isn't a finale either.
I also think a movie structurally is where the series is heading to. I think as the TV series goes on, I think it's trying to do things with the TV structure that I think make it feel like really what it just wants to be is a movie, where everything's just one big thing, and it doesn't have to juggle around a bunch of subplots and so on and so forth. Like, with a movie, you can just have one big story. And I think that's what the series has kind of deep down been like craving, like since Series 2 at least. Okay, I will look at some Cross stuff. There's an interview from 2014, Series 4 came out at the very end of 2015, so this is related to Series 3 instead. And I just think there's a lot of stuff here you two might be interested in. It might be interesting to talk about. And then there's another interview which is even more interesting after this. So this one, he's talking about, we know the history of Neil Cross is he was a novelist first, and then he started dipping his toes in with some adaptational stuff and TV and film work. He eventually became like the head writer of the show Spooks, which is like a big high stakesy like homegrown terrorism type of thing. Is that a fair characterization, Tyler?
Yeah, are you talking in the sense that I think I described to you the other day, Cross's take on this kind of thing is very similar to Skyfall.
Yeah.
Rather than it being a big state thing or a government thing, it's all of the power is harnessed by a single randomly evil individual. Yeah.
So that was where he cut his teeth, I guess, more in TV. Obviously, we know him. Eventually, he starts doing some Doctor Who. He did 2 2013 episodes, which I like them both a lot, Hyde and the Rings of Akaton. Anyway, in this interview, he's talking about how his career as a novelist influenced him. And he says, as a novelist, I was still learning my craft, how to strip story down and be as unencumbered as possible. A sidebar, that might feed into the movie impulses, like Gig was raising, that the series yearns to be a movie, in that it's a movie is by nature more unencumbered than a TV show, isn't it? It's just a big solid thing. Anyway, back to Cross. What I learned fed into storytelling on screen, then what I learned about screenwriting fed into the novels. But TV has become, in a sense, a literary form of expression. The Sopranos was year zero in as much as it was approached by its audience in the same way as a Dickens part work was approached by its audience. A big, long, fat story eaten up in chunks. The Wire clearly exists in cultural space that was in the Victorian era inhabited by the novel. He'll talk about the psyche of novelists in a second, but before that, any thoughts on the structural stuff he's talking about there?
I've never looked at it this way. I find it really, really fascinating. The specifically the analogy with things like Conan Doyle writing in The Strand, or Dickens publishing novels, or I think Dickens also published in The Strand, didn't he? So I really like the idea of the episodic season formula of TV being similar to the consumption of Victorian literature. I don't have anything to add to that. I think that's a beautiful analogy.
He's getting at something very truthful there when he talks about some of the greatest TV, some of the greatest writer-led TV having a novelistic quality to it almost. I mean, if anyone who's watched like The Wire can easily see. I mean, they got like not actual novel writers to contribute to the writing room, didn't they? So that's the whole thing. That's the way in which that show almost like has so many separate things going on simultaneously, but it is so dense that every new episode feels like a chapter of a novel in some way, or almost a novel unto itself. Like that is a huge thing. So he's talking about something very true there.
I think I'm wary. I think it's very easy for like TV nerd people like us to trek into the semantically inane and dull conversations where it's like, was X a film or a TV episode? Like I like, it's so tempting. Like, was Cracker, TV films? Was Columbo a series of films? Yeah, it's very easy to get into that. So I don't want to get into that. But still, I do find it so interesting the different forms TV exists in. Like, I know Gig and I discussed that A Christmas Carol 2019 show, and that was broadcast in different ways. In some places, it was broadcast as a big fat film, all in one, and then in other places, it was broadcast as separate episodes. A show I really love, Peter Harness's War of the Worlds adaptation, in some places it was broadcast as 3 episodes, and in others, without any cuts, it was broadcast as 2 episodes, just a different structural shape. And then, like Luther, the Fallen Son is going to be a film in cinemas, but more on Netflix. And we're just getting all these little crossovers where the form is kind of breaking down in interesting different ways. And when he brings up Dickens and like serials, that's something now, like if I read something by like Dostoevsky or by Dickens, it's in the shape of a novel. Like literally it's in the shape of a Penguin Classics novel or whatever. But what is it exactly? Because it wasn't published as one big text. Like a lot of people read it this way these days, but it didn't. It came out serialized, across successive publications of magazines or journals or whatever. And once you know that, I think some parts of it make more sense. Like, oh, is that why Dickens writes so much? Or is that why this bit is repeating here? Like, why am I getting this reestablished to me now? Like, I feel like the same thing is happening with TV, like when people binge it, that if you binge all 4 episodes of Luther season 5 in one row, you're going to have a different experience. Like the same day I finished Luther season 4, I started Luther season 5, which, were years apart in reality. But to me, that's kind of woven them together in a form that they didn't exist the way they were broadcast in. So I think I'm always wary of getting too uninteresting with those kinds of talks. But I think Neil Cross is similar to us 3 in that he finds all that kind of form stuff very interesting in how it affects the experience of the reader or the viewer.
It is fascinating, and unless you're inclined to dedicate your time in such a way that you watch something in the order that it was broadcast, in the way that it was broadcast. So say if you were to watch season 1 of Luther week by week and then leave it alone for 2 years and come back to Luther, if you were somebody who was dedicated enough to do something like that, then you would have the experience that it was, I don't want to say the word meant to be consumed, because it's not necessarily something that was intentional in the way that, for example, Happy Valley season 3 left it for 6 years as an intentional story thing. Maybe you could say more with things like Luther that the 2, 3, 4 year gaps are to do with production issues than the story intent. But certainly the way that it was originally produced and originally consumed by the people that saw it for the first time. and that has resulted in me having seen the original broadcasting of the show, experiencing seasons in a very different way. I've also now got a similar experience to you, Neo, with season 4 and 5 of Luther, where I see them as linked in a way that I didn't previously, because I have seen them in close succession, and because I now recognise the connections that were being drawn and the foundations of season 5 that were being laid in season 4. I do see them as one almost cohesive entity. So I think simply inherently to media, you will consume things differently retroactively than how they were originally published.
Let's say a kid these days starts to watch, I don't know, Doctor Who Series 1, and let's say they do Tyler's idea of they space it out a week by week, so they try and approximate the experience. That's all well and good, but Tony Blair isn't the Prime Minister anymore. You know what I mean? And Britney Spears isn't in the charts anymore. And so there's all these little things that you just cannot replicate. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a thing with how stories age that I can't, without, doing my own research and whatnot, I can't know, was Cross commenting on a certain thing in the papers at the time? It's hard for me to know that from a different country, and from a different time now I'm watching them. And I think it's just a consequence of how stories age. And sometimes that leads to new and interesting things, really, them being kind of disassociated from their originating times. But it's all a lovely ball of sometimes interesting, sometimes boring complexity.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's inherent to literature, isn't it? That's something that, we as contemporary readers will read Herodotus differently to the way that he was published, and Ovid differently, and Shakespeare differently to the way that it was originally performed, and just by nature of, as I said, reading or consuming things retroactively.
Well, kind of on that note of aggrandizing talk about literature that we're engaging in, the article says to Cross, why don't more novelists cross over to the screen? And Cross says it's because of novelist ego. He says, when screenplays are at their best, the writer is invisible. You've got to be content with that. Even if you're David Simon, that's the Wire showrunner, you're still overshadowed by Stringer Bell. That's Idris Elba's character. You're part of a large corporate effort to make a thing rather than having your name in gold embossed type on the front cover. Most novelists are too encumbered by this notion that they have something important to say. I'm dancing around the fact that most novelists are scum. If I was stuck in a lift, I'd rather be with a bunch of screenwriters than a bunch of novelists. Most novelists are carping, self-obsessed bores. With a bunch of screenwriters, it's like Easy Company in Band of Brothers. You just sit in that elevator and swap war stories for hours.
Holy shit. Okay. Nice. Sure. Okay.
I wonder whether this is a personal thing, whether Cross as an individual has just had some bad run-ins with fellow novelists, rather than this being a fact of life.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear that from someone who has written a novel and who's also written TV as well. I think I guess the difference between the professions, as he characterises it here, is that the screenwriter is by nature someone who works with a great variety of many people. They are part of a huge team, and the novelist, the form of the novel is all, as we conceive it, is all of one person just putting their thoughts down. There is almost something narcissistic about the novel form, as we currently think about it. It is just one person's brain, stream of consciousness almost. An entire world of paper created by one, God figure. Rather than in TV where you give your scripts to other people and they take it and they put their own things into it. So yeah, obviously it's probably a bit unkind to just stereotype all novelists or all screenwriters one way or the other. But it is interesting that, I think for someone to have both experience in both fields and to say that maybe he prefers the screenwriting world purely because it is not all about him. He feels there is a degree of trust and mutual cooperation in letting other people add their interpretations. And yeah, that kind of, maybe it says a lot about him as a writer.
On that ego front, what he says next ties directly into that. So the interview starts talking about this series he's doing for the American NBC network called Crossbones, a big pirate show, which Cross took on the role of showrunner for that.
And he named it after himself.
Crossbones, yeah. It was a big budget 5-month shoot. Gonna be honest, I've never heard of this show before. Is that my own ignorance?
I've never heard of it either.
No, not heard of it either.
John Malkovich was starring in it, but so I don't know how this show went. Anyway, Cross says of being a showrunner, I took a certain English reticence to the role. I knew I was showrunner, but it took a few weeks to realize quite what that means in the States. You're the person where the buck stops at every level. You're the boss. And that was liberating and terrifying. Coped with it by happily admitting that I was massively unqualified to take those decisions, but that's how you learn, by consulting with people who know what they're doing. This whole collaborative thing is very clear with him.
I respect that. I respect the humility.
He talks, this kind of configures back around Doctor Who, which of course really led the showrunner role, at least in terms of being identified that way in the United Kingdom. The showrunner role, Russell T Davies with Doctor Who, was a huge, huge force with that. Cross says the position of showrunner is much to the benefit of television when he's asked about the showrunner role becoming more to the fore in British TV. Cross says because when a writer develops a show and it's filtered through another producer, there's a pressure for a reversion to the mean. Sidebar, Gig and I, when we recently talked about Disney Plus and how their shows don't have showrunners. Instead, they have that separation between writer and producer in our I'm Needed RTD conversation. That's what Cross is talking about there. Anyway, back to Cross. He says, with something truly extraordinary that varies from the norm in any number of ways, there's going to be a tendency to push it back into what's more mainstream, more expected. And that's what I harp on about why I love with Doctor Who that it's so utterly centralized into. Of course, many people are hugely important to the maker of Doctor Who. There's all sorts of producers and stars and the composers and the directors and all sorts of crew members that are hugely, hugely important to the show. But the show is still abnormally, in both UK and I think American television as well, it's abnormally configured around the reign of singular people, singular men. And I love that because I think it's so interesting to see kind of the auteur, super authorial vision of, like, it's too much for any one man to handle, which is kind of the interesting thing with how Doctor Who was ran. But I think a lot of it is what Neil Cross is articulating quite well there, that when you have one person with so much crazy power and so much, this is filtering through me and I get to decide how this is filtered through, it really lets a kind of purity and clarity of vision, which I find really intoxicating. What do you guys think of the benefits he's talking about there?
I think in some cases it doesn't necessarily have to be like the writer, because I think in the case of Luther, like what's filtering through is not just Cross's vision, but also Idris Elba's as the star.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it's all about like having the people who are at the heart of it are the ones who have the power. I think that's where you get like the clarity of vision that you talk about. I think as long as that's there, then you're probably going to get something quite good, provided they know what they're doing, of course, and have good ideas.
Cross closes that interview just talking about the difference between writing film scripts and TV scripts, which he says, in feature films, you have no rights at all, but that's how it should be. It's a director's medium. If you accept the necessary condition that a film script is not there as an expression of the writer's vision, it's just you telling a story as well as you possibly can for the director to interpret according to his or her vision, it becomes weirdly liberating. End quote. I think that's huge why TV showrunner Damon Lindelof, Watchmen, Lost, The Leftovers in particular, his films get a lot of shit. People are like, this is a phenomenally bad script for a film. A lot of people will say, maybe with a lot of hyperbole, depending on your opinion. But how can his shows be good if his movies are bad? And it's not a comparable job at all. I know it says writer, in both credits, but writing a film, it's like Cross is saying, it's not you giving something to the audience, it's you give something to the director and then they make the film as they will. Whereas writer is the key role in TV and directors are the ones, more subsumed to the TV machinery. In most cases, there's pushback on that. But there's change with that with some things, like True Detective Series 1, and there's other shows where directors get abnormal amounts of power. But generally, TV is the writer medium, film is the director medium. Cross finds that liberating. I think that's interesting.
Although in the case of the Luther film, the director is someone who worked on Luther as a TV show. Like I think he directed some of... Yeah.
It's that blurry lines as well, again, isn't it? Yeah. that's also, I'm not unsympathetic to when people like say Columbo is a series of films or whatever, because I get what they mean, but it's still subsumed to, it was produced like TV, even though it's kind of received as a film in some ways. Very different machinery. There's another interview. This is the last thing I have to talk about. This interview is interesting. It predates Luther. It's from 2009. So it's in more the novelist days of Neil Cross. Well, it's in the Spooks days. And there's a couple of things here I just think are relevant to our conversation. So Cross says, when his show Spooks is screening, well, the article says, when Spooks is screening, recruitment for the British Security Service MI5 goes up. Neil Cross says, but when we kill a character, recruitment dips enormously. And we kill people consistently, says Cross, smiling. I think I have the highest hit rate. We were talking about how Luther sheds characters. I just think it's interesting to see Cross back many years ago talking about he enjoys killing off characters and the effect that has.
That's a quite fascinating relationship between the writer
and the effect that has on national security.
Yeah,
that's quite a huge thing to toy with, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it shows consciousness of his role as almost like a quasi-propagandist, and how that can go one way or the other. Like when you're telling stories about like law enforcement and people who are in power, kind of making them into the heroes or the villains or the people who die, in the way that weird kind of psychic effect that mass media storytelling has on the populace. I think, So I think it's something interesting to take into account when thinking about Cross as a Luther writer, and when he's writing about law enforcement and the death penalty and all that shit. Like, I think and how he presents the police as this corrupt force. I think he's maybe aware that his writing doesn't necessarily just have a positive effect on, like, say, security state or whatever. Maybe it also can be like sort of discouraging towards it, or like, you can go both ways. He's not just like some uncritical propagandist.
I think that's what season 3 is. I think season 1 of Luther is quite heavy propaganda a lot of the time, but I wouldn't call season 3 that at all. In fact, I would say that we were talking earlier about the insanity of the famed detective John Luther saving a paedophile and going to the extreme of being beaten up to do so. So he's not, like you say, he's not like a hard and fast cop lover or anything.
Yeah, so the article talks about, so Neil Cross was the head writer, like we've said, for Spooks, the spy, drama, espionage, homegrown terrorism type stuff, that sort of show. So with Spooks, that spy drama, espionage show, Cross was the head writer on for a while. He had to anticipate world events to keep the series feeling contemporary, which is interesting because we've talked about how Luther sometimes it does, but it more feels a bit unmoored from reality, I think, in some ways. Intentionally, I think, trying to be less political in some ways. So to engage with the world for Spooks, it says Cross Googles in bizarre and sometimes nasty places with the assumption that the worldwide cyber snooping system often picks him up. Cross is solitary and domestic, a novelist who thinks most novelists are scummy people, a fond dad who has the name of his Kiwi wife tattooed on his inner left wrist. He hasn't made many New Zealand friends in his years here. If you do my job, Cross says, it's almost impossible to ever meet anybody because I never leave the house. I'm almost certain my email is monitored. It would be astonishing if it wasn't. My internet searches include how to make dirty weapons, how to weaponize viruses, assassination techniques, and not just casual surfing, but deep, For one potential episode, I spent about 3 days looking at very, very racist websites. So there's racism, there's nuclear technology, there's dirty bombs, vile stuff, all coming into this little house in Crofton Downs. If this guy ever leaves the house, we're in serious trouble. Yeah. I think earlier, Tyler, you and I were talking about how Cross, in some ways, and he's self-aware about this, he seems like a very scared man in a lot of ways. I think it's interesting to hear him speak to that kind of thing here.
Yeah, he's got I think, quite open anxiety about many different facets of life, and they that bleeds through in Luther in many ways, and it helps to prop up the show. I think back to the Satanic Panic conversation we had in season 1.
I think that description of Cross that you kind of went over, it kind of makes him sound like he'd be one of the killers in Luther. I think sometimes the killers in Luther feel a bit like externalizations, or not self-inserts of Cross, but kind of some element of like Cross's sort of fascination with like the dark, all the dark shit that he Googles, and just the way that he, hides himself away. You have the killers in series 2 who are kind of like secreted away from the world. I think Cross is kind of, he embodies that to a certain degree. Like he's putting that weird element of himself in the show as these strange kind of geeky, nerdy, or kind of bizarre figures with these strange compulsions.
Series 3 has that stuff with that dead victim's, Barnaby's daughter's face, like photoshopped onto like obscene materials as well. There's a lot of stuff here that is clearly drawn from Cross finding terrible stuff online.
Even like the paedophile in this series, and how he's like an academic paedophile who advocates for, and that's a morbidly accurate like characterization drawn straight from real life. So and it's that's why it's kind of what's so fascinating. Like in some ways it's very easy to just take all the darkest shit from the internet and just put it into your fiction, but at the same time it's part of the tone of Luther as a show, just sort of part of the existential kind of chaos that the show depicts, and it's just part of the show's identity, really.
There's a couple of anecdotes in this article I wanted you guys to hear. So the article reads, Spooks is about a group of MI5 agents based in a secure set of London offices known as The Grid. Among the show's advisors are retired MI5 officers, as well as former spooks from the CIA and the KGB. But Cross, quote, very rarely makes use of them, because the amount of research I've done, I don't trust the word of spies. And what I want to know from these advisors isn't what they're going to tell me, end quote. Here we go. Series 7 was very harsh on the Russians, and Cross remembers a first read-through with the cast on episode 1. Quote, I'd done a search and found this stuff that Karl Marx had said about the Russians. Something about the Russian beast never slumbering and its avariciousness. And this was going on, and I just heard a voice behind me going, this is all bullshit. It was an ex-KGB man. A guy in a black 3-button suit with a black polo neck behind it, dark hair swept back. Nobody in the history of the world has looked more like an ex-KGB agent. And he sat at the back, about 2 feet away. After that, I avoided him. I shifted to the other side of the room.
This reminds me of Michael Imperioli's anecdote about James Gandolfini getting a phone call from a mobster.
Yes.
Saying, we love what you're doing, but the Don doesn't wear shorts and hangs up.
Yeah. Well, the next one is similar to that. It's another peculiar incident happened at a meeting in a new building of Kudos, the producers. They were there in the glass-fronted boardroom with coffee, cake and muffins, ready to start discussing storylines for a new series of spooks, when the executive producer's phone went. Uncharacteristically, she took the call and hurried out, returning 10 minutes later to explain to the baffled production team that MI5 had been on the line to discuss a potential legal issue over Spooks' use of the title MI5 on American TV. Cross and the others didn't think the call was a coincidence. They were convinced the security services were ringing just to say, we're listening. It was a very strange moment. So he thinks he's being spied on as he's writing his spy show.
When you're touching on matters such as what Cross was touching on with MI5 and national security and international relations and things, of course they're watching. And of course they're considering the impact that it's having on the public and international relations.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just pretty obvious. Like, you're making a whole epic TV drama about this shit. Like, of course you're embroiling yourself in it. You can hardly complain when they come and sort of tap you on the shoulder. Like, that's the game you've entered into, sort of turning these guys into drama.
He talks for Islam a while in that article, but then at this later bit, maybe connects to some of the class stuff we've talked about with Luther. He says, when he's talking about the kinds of things MI5 are scared of, Yeah, Cross says, you're going to see the birth of all kinds of radical groups. One of the things MI5 fears most of all is a resurgent revolutionary middle class radicalism. That would be an interesting story to tell. And I guess some of the Marwood stuff is maybe playing around, with societal uprising and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not entirely sure. I agree with him. There's much value in a middle class liberal uprising. What are they really going to do? But there's certainly some interesting drama to pick out in it, I guess.
Perhaps the issue is not so much that, like, oh, what are all those dangerous, posh, like, middle-class people? Maybe the issue is more the idea of middle class becoming sympathetic with, like, the working class and then forming, like, a united front.
Yeah, gaining some sort of class consciousness, yeah.
Then that's really, yeah. Then that becomes quite, an imposing presence.
Well, Tyler, you're an England man. You're in England all the time. Some of this discrepancy might come from what comes next in the article, which says Cross worries that he will lose touch with his British audience, even though he goes back to Britain 4 or 5 times a year. So he builds a British bubble, listening to Radio 4 all day, reading the British press online, looking at what the fans say about his show. It's a strange life. I never quite feel at home either in Britain or here in New Zealand. I mean, the only place I feel at home is at home in my house. The British bubble thing, I think, is interesting.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that in building himself a bubble of his own fantasy Britain, he's helped to usher forth his London, Gotham City, which isn't quite real London, but also is. It's a very believable depiction of London in the way that other TV shows don't either don't get right or don't choose to depict. So I know for certain that Cross understands London, the murkier parts of it and the different boroughs of it in a way that maybe other writers don't or haven't utilised. But the fact that he doesn't live in the country and that he receives all of his information through the internet and radio is quite interesting, because I think it helps to buffer his comic book vision of what that London could be in its. Schenk has that line, doesn't he? Depravity is not in short supply in this city, and that's what Luther London is.
Yeah, it's kind of the media construct rather than necessarily the geographical place, like the physical, soil or concrete of the area. It's the ideas that are flying around and sort of get synthesized into this kind of fictitious London.
Cross goes on to say, writing is a neurotic compulsion, and if he doesn't write, he gets irritable and restless. Writers tend to be solitary anyway, he thinks, although in his case, the tendency may have been stiffened by the long period of bullying he suffered as an English child in a Scottish school. The myth of the alcoholic writer is actually a function of these solitary people having to find some confidence to mix in public and only being able to do it while drunk. It was certainly true of me. I drank very heavily when I was forced to not be solitary. That was when he worked in the sales division of a large British publisher. After being expelled from school, he spent years on the dole. Then he went to university and studied literature, doing undergraduate and postgraduate theses on the American novelist Joseph Heller, who was his hero. I even changed my middle name to Yossarian. It's on my passport. He joined the publishing house so he could meet writers. He was shattered by their banality and nastiness.
That explains his hatred of novelists then, I guess. He had that experience. He was looking up to them so much.
Yeah, and I suppose in a sense, he's always seen these people as coming from a different world than him, and then he meets them, and in many cases they're dicks. And that's quite a reality shattering thing to happen, in my experience.
He says he turned his novel Always the Sun in 2004 into a screenplay. His agent pushed it around, and 2 big production houses ended up bidding for it. That in turn led to the invitation to join the Spooks writing team. Yes, he says it sounds like a fairy tale. He and Nadja, his wife, brought their 2 sons to New Zealand 6 years ago after getting sick of London, its traffic, its lack of green spaces, its clamour. Remember, this article is from 2009, so 2009, take away 6. A year after September 11, there was still a constant anxiety about terrorist attack. It's all very different in Crofton Downs, where he lives. Cross describes himself as, drumroll, as a libertarian leftist.
Okay.
Of course he does.
And is bothered by the state's intrusion on our lives. The electronic surveillance network system that links New Zealand with the United States and Britain scoops masses of information every second from our emails and other communications is the real tie that binds Wellington and Washington, he says, because New Zealand is the main listening station for the South Pacific. I love the mouse that roared thing, the way New Zealand stopped American warships, but there's very little strategic interest down here, so there's no reason for American nuclear vessels. If New Zealand had decided to abandon that shared security system, he suggests the fight with the US would have been far more serious. So how does a left-winger feel about writing a spy show that acts as unofficial and unpaid recruitment for MI5? You know, Cross says, I've never really thought about it. But I often made the joke amongst the team that we were a left-wing team making a right-wing show. He reconsiders and changes right-wing to conservative. In any case, Spooks isn't a political platform of mine. MI5, he notes, says on its website that it never engages in assassinations. Cross doesn't believe this. There is documentary evidence that an IRA enforcer, the man who tortured and killed supposed informants, was a British SAS man under deep cover. He systematically killed loyal IRA terrorists. Spooks shows the spies killing people. In one episode, they let off a bomb in Tehran, but the writers strive to keep the audience's sympathy for their characters. In that episode, quote, we showed how much they didn't want to do it and how great the threat to Britain was had they not done it. That's the kind of choice these people have to make in real life. And not everybody in that kind of job likes what they have to do. So there's a lot of political explication from Cross there. Any thoughts on all that?
I think he does kind of tip his hand a bit.
Bear in mind, it's from a long time ago as well, 2009. But yeah, Tyler, what do you think?
I can sympathise with the need to. I mean, Spooks at this stage in his life, and even now, it's the thing that made him. So at this stage in his life, it's his lifeline, and I understand the need to apply such a nuance to your career that you can excuse its shortcomings, its moral shortcomings. I think that maybe the reason that he suggests, I don't believe for a second that he never thought about the propagandistic elements of the show. I do not believe that for a second. I think the reality is that he chooses not to think about these things and perhaps distances himself from ideology as a grown man because of what his job at the time was. Because maybe had he thought a bit more deeply about what he was doing with Spooks, he would have had to have stepped away from it. And I also understand that the reality of working in such a thing as the British Secret Service is also a nuanced experience, and that you do have to, out of a sense of duty, do things that you think aren't necessarily appropriate. I'm not completely blind to. I'm not John Luther. I don't think everything is as clear cut and binary as good and evil. But I think that I get a sense from that interview of a intentional disconnect from reality by Cross.
I think when he talks about in that bit about maintaining sympathy for the characters and how we always make sure to show that they don't really want to do it when they do it anyway. They're sad about it after they've killed people and such, and but they have to because the threat is too great and so on. I think what that inherently is that it is inherently a way of thinking about it that stops at the level of personal responsibility. And because if you aren't interrogating things on the question of why, not in the sense of are they good or bad people for doing it, but is the actual overarching institutional structure that leads this to become the reality, right or wrong or whatever. I think if you aren't thinking about on that higher level, then you are inherently going to be writing something conservative. Even if you are conceiving yourself as oh yeah, we're leftist or whatever, we're giving it the left-wing take, or we don't really care about that. I think one way or the other, like, it's the political lean comes from almost like the structure of just like the procedural structure, just like the heroic, like, enforcement official or spy structure or whatever, where you can't really question the authority or like the underlying system or structure or whatever.
The reality of Cross's job at the time was that he was writing a show about the British Security Service for the BBC. So simply by the very nature of his job description, he was writing conservative content, and that is something that, as a man, he had to grapple with. And so I can fully sympathise with that, and I understand his reasoning for what I perceive to be a disconnect from political ideologies. But I think there are some writers who are capable of doing both. I think of we will, I think, be discussing Cracker at some point, so I won't.
Of course, yeah.
I won't divulge too much here. But I think that Jimmy McGovern is a man who's capable of having the experience of a left wing, relatively far left wing, but also quite multifaceted creator, doing a job that is inherently conservative and establishment. I think that it's dependent on the type of man.
It's the writer's burden.
The type of writer, the type of person that you are. Yeah.
And, often sometimes the work doesn't necessarily tell you everything about the man. Like, sometimes it can be the other way around. You have a show like The Wire, which goes to such lengths to institutionally deconstruct all the systems that lead to the corruption of Baltimore. And then you have, like, the writer David Simon, who's, like, this complete milquetoast, like, centrist figure who's constantly getting into, like, beefs on Twitter. It's like, yeah, you can't infer everything about the creator from the work.
Well, Cross did write a memoir in 2005. I very recently got a copy of, called Heartland. So if any work you can conflate with a man, it's a memoir. So I'm looking forward to reading that and getting more insight into who he is as a man and how he thinks. But yeah, I just thought these, oldish interviews now were a really interesting insight onto him, especially the stuff in this series. Yeah. Do we have any more thoughts on Cross's stuff there?
Well, I just think such of a big element in how Luther and his team like catch the killers and stuff is that sense of surveillance, being able to track phones and like look at everything in the cameras and everything. So in a way, the things that maybe Cross says he's like suspicious of, like the constant surveillance and stuff, are things that become tools of almost sort of quasi-heroism in the police procedural format. So again, it's another case of him kind of working with the things that make him personally kind of uneasy.
A little random Series 3 note just on my mind is back in our Series 1 discussion, I know, Tyler, you and I were surprised by that like Series 1 minisode on iPlayer that showed Schenk like pouring vodka into his coffee or something, like his drink during the day, his hot drink, because we didn't really read Schenk as an alcoholic or anything like that. And so I thought that was just like a maybe improvised moment from the actor or something just for that little minisode all throughout Series 1 and 2. But then in Series 3, we get in one of these episodes, the day after Ripley and Luther have their scrap in the office, we see Schenk take a drink from a flask in broad daylight at the scene of a crime. And yeah, it was a bad crime and everything, but I'm sure he's seen worse before. So I was just surprised to see, I guess, the minisode is canon, as you could say. Schenk does like his alcohol. Interesting note there.
I just think it's worth noting, because we haven't really specifically said this point, that we end on Southwark Bridge again with John and Alice, which is where it started. And this lends credence to your feeling about it, the show being over, this cyclicality of the first meeting between John and Alice and the perhaps final one where they've chosen their life. And the song's playing in the background, which the line in the song is something about but I've chosen to stay.
Yeah, the song's called "I'm Never Going to Give You Up." It's that sort of thing.
yeah, exactly. So it does work definitely as a cyclical ending to the show. But I also think that and something that Idris Elba picked up on, and again, this is something that we'll speak about in the next podcast, because the album that he released was released on the date of season 4, episode 1. But something that he picked up on in that album was the concept of bridges in Luther, and the idea of characters moving from one side, from one place to another, and what the bridges symbolically represent. So I don't think it has to be final. I think that the nature of a bridge is that it comes out on two sides, and I don't think you have to end Luther where it ended in season 3. And I think that what Cross chooses to do in season 4 and 5 are fascinating from a character perspective.
Well said, Tyler.
Yep, I don't have anything to add to that.
That wraps us up for today, discussing Luther Series 3. Listeners, let us know your thoughts on Luther, this third series of Luther, those Neil Cross interviews we talked about towards the end, stuff we had to say, anything we didn't have to say, let us know. We always love looking at the comments. And next up, Series 4, Series 5, Idris Elba's album, the comic relief skit on Luther, lots of stuff next. That'll be an interesting one for sure. Thank you again for listening. Let us know your thoughts. Cheers.